Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been sitting on this story for over 25 years now. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew exactly what would happen if I shared it. The eye rolls, the condescending smiles, the logical explanations from people who weren't there. But I can't keep it bottled up anymore. And I figure this is probably the safest place to finally get it off my chest. This happened back in October of 1996. I've been hunting the Cascade Mountains in Washington state since I was a kid, following my dad and grandfather before me. We're talking 3 generations of Matthews men who've tracked deer through those woods. I know those mountains better than I know the layout of my own house. Every ridge, every valley, every seasonal creek, they're all mapped in my head from years of experience. That October, I decided to do a solo hunting trip. My buddy Jake had to bail last minute because his kid got sick, so I figured what the hell, I'd go it alone. Wasn't my first solo trip, and I was comfortable being out there by myself. The weather was perfect, that crisp autumn chill that makes the air feel clean in your lungs. Leaves were turning, but hadn't all dropped yet. I drove up early on a Thursday morning, parked my truck at one of the old logging roads about 30 miles east of North Bend, and hiked in about 4 miles to a spot my dad had shown me years back. It's this little clearing near a year-round stream, tucked between 2 ridges, perfect spot, that most hunters don't know about or can't be bothered to hike to. By early afternoon, I had my camp set up. Just a small 2-man tent, my gear, and a makeshift fire pit. That first day was uneventful. Spotted some decent buck sign, fresh rubs on trees, some tracks by the stream, droppings that couldn't have been more than a day old. I didn't take any shots though, just scouted and planned for the next morning. Slept like a rock that night, dead tired from the hike in. The next morning, Friday, I was up before sunrise. Had some instant coffee and a protein bar, grabbed my Remington 7mm and headed out. The morning was foggy, with that low-hanging mist that hugs the ground and makes everything damp. By mid-morning, I'd been hiking ridgelines for a few hours without much luck, so I doubled back toward that stream near my camp to take a break. That's when everything changed. I was kneeling by the stream, refilling my water bottle, when I noticed something in the soft mud of the bank about 20 feet upstream. At first I thought maybe it was deer tracks, but as I got closer, I realized they were nothing like that. These were footprints, human-like footprints, except they were massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say they were at least 15 inches long. 5 toes, clearly defined, no arch like a human foot would have. The impression was deep too, maybe 1.5 inches into the mud, which meant whatever made them was heavy, really heavy. I've tracked bear, elk, deer, and every other animal in those mountains my whole life. These weren't bear tracks. Bears don't have 5 distinct toes like that, and the shape was all wrong. These looked like a giant human foot, but no human has feet that big. The stride length between prints was what really got me, easily 5 to 6 feet apart. I'm 6'2", and if I tried to match that stride, I'd have to jump from print to print. I had this old disposable camera with me. I always carried one to document any big kills, so I snapped a few photos of the prints. Wish I'd had a ruler or something to show the scale, but I wasn't exactly prepared for this. I ended up putting my hunting knife next to one for reference in a couple shots. I followed the tracks upstream for maybe a 1/4 mile before they veered off into this thick patch of underbrush and disappeared. Part of me wanted to keep following, but something in my gut told me to back off. I've learned to trust that instinct over the years. Instead, I went back to hunting, trying to convince myself I'd just found some weird anomaly. By late afternoon, I'd managed to put the tracks out of my mind and was focused on a promising area where 2 game trails intersected. I was sitting against this big Douglas fir, being patient when the feeling hit me. You know that sensation when someone's watching you, that prickle on the back of your neck? It was like that, but 10 times stronger, and then I noticed the silence. If you've spent any time in the woods, you know they're never actually quiet. There's always something. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But right then, there was nothing. Absolute dead silence, like everything in that forest was holding its breath. I stayed frozen for maybe 20 minutes, scanning the trees around me, my rifle ready, saw nothing. Eventually, the normal forest sounds slowly returned, and that feeling of being watched faded. But I couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled in my gut. I decided to head back to camp early. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains anyway, and I wanted to get a fire going before dark. Kept telling myself I was being stupid, that it was just the tracks messing with my head. At camp, I built up a good fire, cooked some freeze-dried beef stew, and tried to relax. As darkness fell completely, I remember looking up at the stars, thinking how beautiful they were, so bright and clear away from city lights. It almost made me forget about the weird vibes from earlier. I turned in around 10, zipping myself into my sleeping bag inside the tent. I remember checking that my rifle was loaded and within reach before I dozed off. Just a habit, nothing unusual. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My watch said somewhere around 2 in the morning. What I do know is what woke me. The unmistakable sound of a large branch snapping, followed by heavy footsteps. Not the light steps of a deer or even the plodding of a bear. These were deliberate, heavy footfalls that made the ground vibrate slightly with each step. I lay there in absolute stillness, barely breathing as the footsteps approached my camp. They weren't fast, just steady and purposeful. Whatever it was stopped right outside my tent. I mean, right outside, maybe 3 feet from where I was lying. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that didn't sound like any animal I recognized. Then came the smell. It's hard to describe, but imagine a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky. It wasn't overpowering, just present. I had my hand on my rifle, finger near the trigger, but I was terrified to make any movement. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. That's when it made a sound. Not a growl exactly. More like a deep grunt with this weird guttural quality to it. It wasn't a bear or an elk. I know those sounds. This was something else entirely. The grunt was followed by what I can only describe as a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate the air inside my tent. I don't know how long I lay there listening to it breathe. Could have been 5 minutes or 30. Time kind of warps when you're that scared. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, moving away from my tent and back into the forest. The sound faded gradually until I couldn't hear it anymore. I didn't move for at least another hour, just lay there clutching my rifle, straining to hear any sound of its return. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and peek outside, it was still dark, maybe 4 in the morning. The fire had died down to embers. Using my flashlight, I checked the area around my camp. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Obvious footprints in the soft earth, the same huge tracks I'd seen by the stream. My food bag, which I'd hung from a tree branch about 15 feet up, standard practice to keep it away from bears, was untouched, but the branch it was hanging from had been broken at the end, like something tall had reached up and snapped it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, just sat there with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, watching and listening until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up everything as quickly as I could. Didn't even bother with breakfast or coffee, just wanted to get the hell out of there. The whole time I was packing, I kept scanning the tree line, that feeling of being watched creeping back over me. The hike out was the longest 4 miles of my life. About halfway back to my truck, I found another set of those same tracks crossing the trail I was on, fresh ones. Like whatever it was had circled around and crossed ahead of me. I practically ran the rest of the way. When I got back to civilization, I got the film developed right away. The pictures of the tracks came out, but they don't do justice to what I saw. They just looked like big, weird footprints, unless you know what you're looking at. For years, I didn't tell anyone about this, not my wife, not my hunting buddies, nobody. What was the point? Either they wouldn't believe me, or they'd try to explain it away. Oh, it was just a bear. You were tired and imagining things. Someone was playing a prank. But I know what I experienced. I've spent my entire life in those woods. I know every animal that lives there, every sound they make, every track they leave. What I encountered that night wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or since. Call it Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever. I don't care about the name. All I know is it was real. It was there, and to this day, I've never gone hunting alone again. And that stream where I found the first tracks, I've never been back there either. Some places are better left alone. Baskia. Story 2. I've been holding this in for a long time, almost 16 years, to judge. I guess I'm finally ready now. My cousins and I made a pact not to talk about it publicly because, honestly, who would believe us? But I need to get this off my chest. It happened in the fall of 2007 when I was 22. I'm Blackfeet, and this all went down on the reservation in Montana, in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It was one of those perfect Montana days. Warm enough that you didn't need a heavy jacket, but cool enough that you could hunt comfortably all day. The aspens had turned golden, and there was that crisp smell in the air that always makes me think of my childhood. Me, my cousin Derek, and our cousin Thomas had planned this hunting trip for weeks. We'd grown up hunting together, learned from our uncles and grandfathers, and knew these woods like the backs of our hands, or at least we thought we did. We set out around 9 in the morning on horseback. I was riding Smoke, a grey gelding I'd had since I was 16. Derek was on his paint mare, Pepper, and Thomas rode his uncle's buckskin Chief. These weren't skittish horses. They'd been on dozens of hunting trips, heard gunshots, smelled bear and elk and everything else in these mountains. The morning was uneventful. We spotted some elk tracks, but nothing fresh enough to follow. By mid-afternoon, we'd decided to circle back toward a spot where Derek had seen some deer the previous week. It was about a 4-mile ride through some pretty dense country. The sun was warm on our backs as we rode, and we kept conversation minimal, like we always did when hunting. Mostly we were just pointing out tracks or droppings, communicating with hand signals when we could. Around 4 in the afternoon, we came to this promising-looking trail that cut through some thick brush. It was the kind of place deer like to bed down when the sun gets hot. Cool, shaded, and with plenty of escape routes. We'd been down this trail plenty of times before, but something felt different this time. I noticed it first with Smoke. He's usually steady, almost lazy on the trail, but suddenly he was walking differently, placing his hooves down carefully, like he was trying not to make noise. His ears were pricked forward, and every few steps he'd snort softly and shake head. I glanced over at Derek and Thomas, and their horses were acting the same way. We all noticed it, exchanging looks, but nobody wanted to say anything yet. You learn to trust your horse in the backcountry. They sense things before we do. Probably just a bear nearby, Derek whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. We kept our rifles ready, just in case. The brush was thick on both sides of the trail, mostly scrub oak and some pine saplings, creating a sort of tunnel effect. The sun was starting to sink, casting long shadows through the trees. It wasn't dark yet, but the light had that golden quality it gets late in the day. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile down this trail when all hell broke loose. It happened so fast that even now, years later, I have trouble piecing together the exact sequence. Smoke suddenly reared up, something he never does, and nearly threw me. At the same time, Pepper spun in a complete circle, and Chief backed up so quickly he almost sat down. All three horses were breathing hard, eyes wide with what I can only describe as pure terror. Whoa, easy, boy. I was fighting to keep Smoke under control, pulling on the reins while trying not to fall off. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Thomas struggling with Chief, who was now trying to bolt back the way we'd come. "Bear!" I shouted, scanning the brush frantically, trying to locate whatever had spooked the horses. My heart was hammering against my ribs. "I don't think so," Derek called back, his voice tight with tension. He was pointing to our right, toward the thicker part of the brush. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows and branches and the usual forest stuff. Then there was movement, not the kind of movement you'd expect from a deer or even a bear. It was tall. That's what registered first. Tall and moving fast, parallel to the trail about 30 yards away. "What the hell is that?" Thomas hissed. The horses were still freaking out, but somehow we managed to keep them in place. All three of us were staring now as this thing ran alongside the trail. It was partially obscured by the brush, but I could make out a dark, bulky shape, moving with surprising speed and agility. Then it turned. It turned right toward the trail, heading directly across our path about 40 feet ahead of us. And that's when I saw it clearly. I will never, ever forget what I saw in those few seconds. It was shaped like a man, 2 arms, 2 legs, walking upright, but it was massive, probably 7 feet tall at minimum. And the hair, Jesus, it was the hairiest thing I've ever seen. Not like a bear's fur, but longer, more like a shaggy carpet covering its entire body, dark brown, almost black in the fading light. It stopped at the edge of the trail and turned to look at us. That's what gets me the most when I think back on it. It looked at us, not the way an animal glances at you before running away. It turned its entire body, stood there for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, and stared directly at us. I couldn't make out its face clearly. It was too hairy, and the light was wrong, but I could feel its eyes on me. We all froze. The horses were trembling beneath us, but had stopped trying to bolt. It was like time suspended for those few seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, crashing through the brush on the other side of the trail. The speed was unbelievable. One moment it was there, the next it had vanished into the trees, though we could hear branches breaking for several more seconds. None of us spoke. What could we say? We sat there on our terrified horses, listening to our own breathing and the fading sounds of whatever that thing was moving away through the forest. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Did you guys just see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I managed to croak out. My mouth had gone completely dry. "That wasn't a bear," Derek said. His face had lost all color. "That wasn't anything I've ever seen before." The sun was getting lower, and suddenly, none of us wanted to be in those woods after dark. Without discussing it, we turned our horses around and headed back the way we'd come, moving as fast as we safely could on the narrow trail. The horses didn't need any encouragement. They were as eager to get out of there as we were. We didn't talk much on the ride back. What was there to say? We'd all seen the same thing, and none of us had an explanation for it. By the time we reached Derek's truck, where we'd left it that morning, the sun had set, and we were loading the horses into the trailer by flashlight. It wasn't until we were all in the truck, heading back toward town, that Derek finally said what we were all thinking. That was a Sasquatch, wasn't it? His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I didn't answer right away. Growing up on the reservation, I'd heard all the stories. Our elders called it Sa Patosi, the tall, hairy man. But those were just stories, right? The kind you tell around campfires to scare kids. "I don't know what it was," I finally replied. "But it wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a person." Thomas nodded slowly from the back seat. Whatever it was, it seemed as surprised to see us as we were to see it. That night, none of us slept well. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. But no bear moves like that. Maybe it was some guy in a costume, but who would be out there, miles from any road in a costume? And no costume I've ever seen moves that naturally or has that kind of bulk to it. The next morning, we made a decision. We had to go back. We had to know. So we loaded up the horses again and rode back out to that same trail. It was different in the morning light, less threatening somehow. The horses were calmer too, though they still seemed wary as we approached the spot where we'd had our encounter. We tied them to some trees and began searching the area on foot. It didn't take long to find evidence. There were broken branches on both sides of the trail, not at deer height, but between 6 and 8 feet off the ground. Something big had passed through here. Then Thomas called us over to a patch of soft ground just off the trail. There, pressed into the dirt, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. It had 5 toes, like a human foot. But the shape was different, wider at the front, with a less pronounced arch. We found 3 more prints, each one showing a clear stride pattern of something walking on 2 legs. The stride length was massive, over 4 feet between prints. Could be a hoax, Derek said, but his heart wasn't in it. We were miles from anywhere, on tribal land where outsiders rarely ventured. Who would go to all this trouble? I asked. And why? And how did they make a costume that moved like that? We took some photos with the cheap digital camera Thomas had brought along, but when we looked at them later, they didn't capture the size or the detail very well. The pictures looked like nothing, just some depressions in dirt, nothing that would convince anyone who wasn't already there. We made a pact that day. We wouldn't talk about what we'd seen, not publicly anyway. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed off the reservation, labeled as drunks or attention seekers. So we kept it to ourselves, though we talked about it among ourselves plenty over the years. I've been back to that spot many times since then, sometimes with Derek or Thomas, sometimes alone. I've never seen anything like that again, though sometimes when I'm in the woods, I get a feeling like I'm being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up for no reason. Smoke still gets nervous in certain areas, even now. It's been almost 16 years, and I still don't know what we saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings online, watched all the TV shows, and compared notes with other stories. Some details match up, others don't. All I know for certain is what I saw with my own eyes, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but something that was undeniably real. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the mountains of the reservation, keeping to itself, watching us from the shadows of the forest. And sometimes when I'm alone in the woods and the light hits just right, I catch myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that tall, hairy figure staring back at me. Story 3: I've debated for months whether to post this. I've been a lurker here forever, but this is my first time actually sharing. What happened to me in St. Clair County still keeps me up at night, and I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of it. I grew up in rural Alabama, right on the edge of thousands of acres of wilderness. These weren't just any woods, they were deep, ancient, and full of mystery. My brother and I spent our childhood exploring every inch of them. We had this beautiful creek that wound through valleys, past abandoned coal mines and old railroad tracks that hadn't been used in decades. It was our playground, our escape. Our Belgian shepherd, Pookie, always came with us on these adventures. That dog was smarter than most people I know. She had this way of keeping us safe. She'd get antsy and start barking if we went too far into certain areas. There were spots she flat out refused to go beyond. As kids, we'd laugh it off. But looking back, I realized she was trying to protect us from something. I remember nights when I was maybe 9 or 10, waking up to the sound of animals approaching our house. Not just regular raccoons or possums, something different. My dad would grab his shotgun and stand on the porch for hours. I'd ask him what was out there, and most times he'd say it was probably just a coyote. But sometimes he'd look at me with this expression I couldn't read and say, "I don't know, Sarah. I honestly don't know." That scared me more than any answer he could have given. As I got older, my brother lost interest in the woods, but I never did. I'd go out with our Australian shepherd Molly and spend hours following that creek. Molly was different from Pookie, more skittish, more alert. There were so many times when she'd suddenly freeze, the hair on her back standing straight up. She'd start growling at the ridge tops, circling around me, trying to herd me back toward home. I'd try to calm her down, but she knew something I didn't. During those hikes, I'd often hear footsteps mirroring mine from the southwestern ridges. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was just an echo or maybe a deer tracking parallel to us, but deep down, I knew better. Fast forward to 2010, I was going through a messy divorce and moved back in with my parents, bringing my kids along. My daughter was 5, my son just 3. We all settled into my old bedroom, the one with the window facing the woods. That's when things started getting really weird. The first night we were there, around 2 in the morning, there was this loud bang on the wall right by my window. Not like a branch hitting it, like someone deliberately pounding on it with their fist. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always at the same time, always the same spot. One evening, about a week after we'd moved in, my mum and I were in the yard picking tomatoes when I noticed something odd near my bedroom window. There, pressed into a patch of moss, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This thing was massive. I put my foot next to it for comparison, and it was easily 3 times the size. The toes were clearly defined, 5 of them, spread wide like whatever made it had been standing there watching. My mum saw it too. She's not one to scare easily, but I could tell she was shaken. "Let's not mention this to your father," she said. "He'll just worry." So we didn't. But 3 days later, we found something even more disturbing. There was this field of tall grass between our house and the tree line. Someone, or something, had walked through it, leaving a trail of flattened grass. The stride length was impossible. I'm 5'8", and when I tried to match the steps, I couldn't even come close. Whatever made those tracks had legs twice as long as mine. That's when the sounds started. These weird whooping noises at night, like someone trying to communicate over a long distance. They'd start from one direction, then be answered from another. My parents' property is about 15 acres, and these sounds seem to surround us completely. Then my daughter started talking about the hairy-faced man who looked at her through the window at night. Kids have active imaginations, I know, but the way she described him sent chills down my spine. "He's big, Mommy," she'd say, "and his eyes shine like Molly's do when we take pictures." I started keeping the curtains closed after that, but she'd still wake up crying sometimes, saying he was watching. The worst night, the night that still makes my skin crawl, happened in early October. My mum and I were sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when we heard it, a howl unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote, it wasn't a dog or a person trying to imitate an animal. This was something primal, something ancient. It started low, then rose in pitch and volume until it seemed to fill the entire valley, and it went on for an impossibly long time, like whatever was making it didn't need to breathe the way normal creatures do. We sat there, frozen, listening to this sound that seemed to come from about a quarter mile away, maybe more, yet was as clear as if it were right next to us. When it finally stopped, my mum looked at me with tears in her eyes. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. The next morning I woke up early. Something pulled me to the window and I stood there scanning the tree line. That's when I saw her. about 75 yards into the woods, sitting on a fallen log, was what looked like a female. I don't even know how to say this without sounding crazy. A female Bigfoot. I grabbed my dad's binoculars from the shelf and focused them. What I saw will stay with me forever. She was covered in black matted hair about 5 inches long. Her face was flat, almost simian, but with strangely human features. She was just sitting there, watching our house. When she shifted position, I could see how massive she was, easily 7 feet tall if she'd been standing. I ran to get my mom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the binoculars. By the time we got back to the window, the creature was gone, just vanished, like she'd never been there at all. But I know what I saw. After that, I contacted some researchers who specialize in this kind of thing. They came out, placed cameras around the property, and left audio recorders running at night. What they captured was fascinating. A series of vocalizations that sounded like chatter between a female and male. The researchers said they'd never heard anything quite like it before. The strange thing is, after their investigation, everything stopped. No more banging on the walls, no more footprints, no more howls in the night. It was like whatever had been watching us knew it had been spotted and decided to move on. I eventually moved away from my parents' place, partly because I found a new job, partly because I couldn't stand being in those woods anymore. My kids still talk about Alabama sometimes, especially my daughter. She's 11 now and still remembers the hairy-faced man who used to look in her window. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or some other creature we don't have a name for. All I know is that it was real. It was watching us, and for whatever reason it was interested in my family. Sometimes I think about going back, about trying to find answers. But then I remember that howl, that impossible, endless howl that seemed to come from something not quite animal and not quite human. And I decide that maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. I still can't explain what I saw that day. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds, but I know what I experienced. Whatever's out there in those Alabama woods, it's watching, and sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is quiet, I swear I can still hear it calling. Story 4. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my immediate family before. I'm not even sure why I'm typing it out now, maybe just to process what happened or see if anyone else has experienced something similar. This happened almost 6 years ago, but I still think about it constantly. It was early June 2017, and I had a rare weekday off. I decided to head out to the Big Piney River near Duke, Missouri, for some fishing. I'd been fishing that river for years and knew all the good spots. There's this one bend I particularly liked because it was secluded. You have to hike about a mile downstream from this unmarked turnoff that most people don't even notice. It opens up into this nice pool with a gravel bar on one side and thick brush on the other. The smallmouth bass fishing there is usually fantastic, and you almost never see another person. I arrived early, around 6 in the morning. The air was cool, but you could tell it was going to be one of those perfect early summer days. I packed light, just my rod, a small tackle box, and a backpack with water, a sandwich, and some basic supplies. The hike in was peaceful, just me and the sounds of the forest waking up. I reached my spot around 6:30 and set up on the gravel bar. The morning started out perfectly normal. I caught 2 decent smallmouth within the first couple hours, nothing huge but good fighters. Between casts, I'd just sit and listen to the birds, watch the water flow by, and enjoy being away from everything. This was my escape, you know, just me and nature. Around 9:30, something changed. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking about moving to a different spot downstream. That's when I noticed the silence. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The birds just stopped singing all at once. No rustling in the brush, no squirrels, nothing. Even the insects seemed to go quiet. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that's usually a warning sign, typically meaning a predator is nearby, maybe a coyote or even a black bear, though they're pretty uncommon in that area. I stood up from where I'd been sitting on a log and looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The river was behind me, about 10 feet away, and dense forest surrounded the gravel bar on 3 sides. I remember thinking I should pack up and head out when I heard it. A footstep. Just one heavy, deliberate footstep from the tree line behind me. Not the sound of a deer or a raccoon moving through brush. This was the unmistakable sound of something large placing its foot firmly on the ground. I spun around, half expecting to see another fisherman who'd somehow snuck up on me. There was nothing there, just the still trees and undergrowth. Then came another step, closer and to my left. The hair on my arms stood up. I backed toward the water's edge instinctively, putting distance between myself and whatever was making that sound. That's when I saw movement in the brush, just a shifting of shadows at first, but then something large pushing through the undergrowth. What stepped out onto that gravel bar made my blood run cold. I've tried for years to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, but I know what I saw. Standing fully upright about 20 feet away from me was something, a creature. It had to be at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe taller. The build was what struck me most. Impossibly broad shoulders, massive arms, a chest like a barrel, and legs like tree trunks. It was covered in thick black hair, not fur exactly, more like very dense human hair. The arms were disproportionately long, hanging down below its knees, with hands that had visible fingers that curled slightly. The face wasn't what I expected. I'd seen those blurry Bigfoot photos and always imagined something ape-like, but this was different. It had a flat, wide nose, a mouth that stretched across its face, and this heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. The eyes were deep-set and dark. I couldn't make out a color, just that they were watching me. The forehead had less hair, almost grayish in color. I couldn't move. The deep part of the river was right behind me, and this thing was blocking my only path back to the trail. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then it took one heavy step forward. I could hear the gravel crunch under its weight. It slightly raised one arm, not in a threatening way, but almost like it was examining me, trying to figure out what I was. My mouth went completely dry. I couldn't have screamed if I wanted to. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then it made a sound, this low rumble that started deep in its chest and built into a sort of throaty grunt. It wasn't particularly loud, but I could almost feel it physically, like when you stand too close to a subwoofer. It took another step closer, now maybe 15 feet away from me. I thought I was dead, I was completely cornered, but then it did something that confused me. It looked down at my fishing gear on the ground. In a surprisingly fluid motion for something so massive, it squatted down. Its knees bent easily despite its huge frame. It sniffed the air, then reached out and picked up my small backpack. It just lifted it with one hand, gave it a single shake, then dropped it and stood back up. That's when I realized something. Despite having me completely cornered, it wasn't acting aggressive. It seemed curious, like it was trying to figure out what I was doing there, what my stuff was. Without any warning, it turned and walked back toward the trees. The way it moved was unsettling, smooth and natural, with shoulders rolling with each stride, arms swinging slightly, not at all like the awkward lumbering you'd expect from something that big. It disappeared into the tree line, and I could hear it moving through the woods for maybe 30 seconds before the sound faded. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. 1 second, I was frozen by the water. The next, I was sprinting along the path back to my truck. I didn't even grab all my gear, just my rod and the backpack. I left my tackle box sitting there on the gravel. I ran the entire mile back to my truck without stopping once, constantly looking over my shoulder. I threw everything in the bed, jumped in the cab, and drove away with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I kept checking my mirrors the whole drive home, half expecting to see it following me somehow. I've never been back to that section of the river. I still fish, but I stick to more open areas with other people around. I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe it was some kind of weird hallucination. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. But I know what I saw. The details are burned into my memory. The weirdest part is that it didn't hurt me when it absolutely could have. It approached me, checked me out, examined my stuff, and then just left. Like it was just curious about the human in its territory. I've read about Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Some accounts describe them as aggressive, others as shy and reclusive. Mine wasn't either. It deliberately approached me and wasn't afraid, but it also didn't show any sign of wanting to harm me. I still go fishing, but everything's different now. Every snapping twig makes me jump. Every time the birds go quiet, I pack up and leave. I'm constantly scanning the tree line. The solitude I used to love now fills me with dread. I know how this sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd think they were making it up or had seen a bear and let their imagination run wild. But I know what I saw that day. Something intelligent was watching me from those eyes. Something that made a decision to approach me, and then a decision to leave me alone. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to get this off my chest. Sometimes I think about going back there with a camera, trying to find evidence. But then I remember those eyes looking at me and that deep rumbling sound, and I know I never will. Story 5. I don't talk about this much. Even after all these years, my hands start to shake when I think about what happened. I've never written it down before, but maybe putting it on paper will help me make sense of it. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I swear on my mother's grave that every word of this is true. It was early February of 1876. Winter in San Diego County ain't like winter in other parts. The days were cool but bearable, perfect for working my claim without the summer heat beating down on you. I'd been prospecting in the hills about 30 miles northeast of the city proper for nearly 7 months. Wasn't striking it rich by any means, but I was finding enough color to keep myself fed and my supplies stocked. That morning started like any other. I woke before dawn, made coffee over a small fire, ate some hardtack, and headed to the shallow creek where I'd been panning. The area was remote, hadn't seen another soul in nearly 3 weeks, except for when I made my monthly trip into the settlement for supplies. That's how I liked it. After fighting in the war and then drifting westward for years, the solitude suited me just fine. By midday, I'd been working steadily, knee-deep in the cold water. My back was aching something fierce from being hunched over my pan for hours. I straightened up to stretch when I heard it, a clear, distinct whistle, not like a bird call, but the kind a person makes to get your attention. 2 short notes. I froze. Out here, you don't expect to hear human sounds. The hairs on my arms stood up despite the warmth of the sun. I turned slowly toward the sound, my eyes searching the rocky hillside above the creek. That's when I saw it. What I first took to be a man sitting on a large boulder about 20 paces up the slope. I remember thinking it odd that someone would be out here, but I figured it might be another prospector checking the territory. I raised my hand in greeting and called out, "Hello there." The figure didn't respond or return my gesture, just sat there watching me. Something felt off, but I couldn't place what exactly. I decided to approach, setting my pan down on the creek bank and wiping my wet hands on my trousers. As I got closer, maybe 10 paces away, the figure suddenly rose to its full height. My blood ran cold. This was no man. What stood before me was like nothing I'd ever seen in all my 43 years. It had the basic shape of a human, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head atop broad shoulders, but it was entirely covered in coarse black hair, 2 or 3 inches long. The creature stood well over 6 feet tall, probably closer to 7, with impossibly long arms that hung down past its knees. I stopped, dead in my tracks. My throat closed up, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The thing's face was mostly hidden behind the hair, but I could make out dark eyes staring intently at me from beneath a heavy brow ridge. Its nose was flat and wide, and I caught a glimpse of large teeth when its mouth opened slightly. We just stood there, staring at each other. I don't know how long. Could have been seconds or minutes. Time seemed to stop. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I'd heard stories from Indians about wild men in the mountains, but had always dismissed them as superstition. Now I wasn't so sure. Finally, I found my voice. "Hello," I said again, softer this time. "Do you understand me?" The creature made no response, just continued to stare. Its chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. I tried Spanish next, having picked up a fair amount during my years in California. "Habla español? Necesita ayuda?" Still nothing. I was desperate to make some kind of connection, to understand what I was facing. I tried the few phrases I knew in Kumeyaay, which I'd learned from trading with local Indians, then some Luiseño words I'd picked up. The creature tilted its head slightly but made no sound. My hand instinctively moved toward the knife at my belt, not to threaten, but for some small measure of security. As soon as I moved, the creature's posture changed. It straightened up even taller and made a low, rumbling sound deep in its throat that made my skin crawl. Then it took a step toward me. I nearly fell backward, trying to retreat. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. But after that single step, the creature suddenly changed direction. It turned with surprising agility and bounded away from me, moving up the hill with incredible speed. It didn't run like a man. It was more fluid, almost like it was gliding over the rough terrain. Within seconds, it had crested the hill and disappeared from view. I stood there shaking, unable to move for what felt like an eternity. Part of me wanted to follow, to see where it went, but my legs wouldn't obey. Eventually, I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the spot where the creature had vanished. When I reached the creek, I grabbed my meager findings and my tools, then hurried back to my camp. I couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside my tent made me jolt upright. The wind in the trees sounded like breathing, and the distant cry of a coyote sent my heart racing. I kept my rifle loaded and close at hand, though deep down I wondered if it would do any good against that thing. As dawn broke, I decided I couldn't stay there. I packed up camp in record time, leaving behind some supplies I couldn't carry. My claim be damned, no amount of gold was worth another encounter. I made the long journey back to the settlement in a single day, pushing myself and my mule to exhaustion. When I reached town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Calloway was a reasonable man who'd helped me file my claim papers when I first arrived. I burst through his door, still dusty from the trail and probably looking half mad. "Turner," he said, surprised to see me. "What brings you back to town so soon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I collapsed into the chair across from his desk and told him everything. To his credit, he listened without interruption, though I could see the doubt creeping into his expression as my story unfolded. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and stroked his mustache. "Turner, how long you been out there alone?" 7 months, give or take," I replied, knowing what he was implying. "I ain't gone crazy, if that's what you're thinking. I know what I saw." He sighed. "I ain't saying you didn't see something. Could have been a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe one of them Indians wearing some kind of ceremonial outfit." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "And it wasn't a man in costume. It moved wrong, too fluid, too fast." Sheriff Calloway took out a ledger and made some notes. "I'll write this up, and if anyone else reports something similar, we'll investigate further. But I can't send men out searching for whatever you think you saw, based on one sighting." I knew that was the best I'd get. I thanked him and left, feeling foolish but still certain of what I'd encountered. I took a room at the boarding house and spent 2 days drinking more than I should, trying to dull the memory. On the 3rd day, I overheard 2 miners talking about heading up to the same general area where my claim was. I interrupted their conversation and warned them about what I'd seen. They exchanged glances and laughed. "Sounds like you met Old Harry," one of them said. "The Indians talk about him, say he's been in them hills since before their grandfather's time." "You've heard of this thing?" I asked, suddenly alert. The miner shrugged. "Just stories. Some of the old-timers who came through during the gold rush claimed to have seen something similar. Most folks reckon it's just tales meant to scare off competition from good mining spots." That wasn't reassuring. If anything, it made it worse, knowing that whatever I'd seen had been out there for decades, possibly longer. I never returned to my claim, couldn't bring myself to go back there. Instead, I took odd jobs around town for a few weeks, then eventually signed on with a freight company running supplies to the outlying ranches, anything to be around other people. In the months that followed, I asked discreetly about similar sightings. Most people just laughed or told me I'd been alone too long. But occasionally, someone would get a serious look in their eye and admit they'd heard something similar from a cousin or a friend of a friend. Never first-hand accounts, though, just stories passed around campfires. I did speak with an old Kumeyaay man who worked as a tracker for some of the ranchers. When I described what I'd seen, he nodded solemnly. "My people know of this one," he said quietly. "We call it by a name that means the one who walks alone. It is very old and very rare. Some say it is a spirit. Others say it is a man who has forgotten he is a man. It is best to leave it be." "Have you ever seen one?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, but my grandfather did when he was young. He said it watched him from the trees for many days while he was hunting. It never came close, never tried to harm him, just watched. That conversation haunted me almost as much as the encounter itself. The idea that these creatures, if there were more than one, had been living alongside us, watching us for generations, was deeply unsettling. Eventually, I left San Diego County altogether, headed north to try my luck in the lumber camps. I never told anyone else about what happened. Who would believe me? Even now, 40-some years later, I sometimes wake up in the night, heart pounding, convinced I hear that distinctive 2-note whistle outside my window. The strangest part, in all these years, I've never been able to decide if the creature meant me harm. It could have attacked. I was clearly no match for its size and strength, but it didn't. It approached, then fled. Was it curious, territorial, warning me away? I'll never know. I've read accounts of strange creatures in newspapers over the years. Some sound similar to what I saw, others wildly different. I don't know what to make of them. All I know is what I saw that day in February of 1876 was real. It was no bear, no man in costume, no hallucination brought on by solitude. Something is out there in the wild places, something that walks like a man, but isn't one. Something that watches and whistles but doesn't speak. And sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I still feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, and I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 6. I've been hesitant to share this for years, but I need to get this off my chest. I'm not typically someone who believes in cryptids or monsters, but what happened to me in November 2017 has completely changed my perspective on what exists in our forests. I live on a small property outside Port Angeles, Washington. It's about 5 acres with my modest house, a small barn, and a couple of outbuildings. The property backs right up against dense forest that stretches for miles. I've always loved the privacy and the connection to nature, though I admit it gets lonely sometimes, especially during the long, dark winters. On November 12th, 2017, a date permanently etched in my memory, I had driven into town for groceries and supplies, just a normal errand run on a gloomy, drizzly afternoon. It was getting dark earlier as winter approached, and by the time I returned home around 4:30, the light was already fading. I remember pulling into my gravel driveway, my headlights cutting through the mist when something caught my attention. As I was unloading groceries from my truck, I noticed unusual marks in the gravel near my barn, like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. My first thought was that maybe a neighbor had come by with equipment while I was gone, but nobody had called, and these marks looked different. They were wide, continuous drag marks, not like tire tracks or footprints. I should have just gone inside. I should have unpacked my groceries and locked my doors. But curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the marks around to the back of the barn where I rarely go, since I just use the front section for storage. The drag marks led into a small clearing behind the barn where I stack firewood, and there, partially hidden behind the woodpile, was a buck, a large one, probably a 4-pointer. It was dead, its neck twisted at an impossible angle. But what really disturbed me wasn't just finding a dead deer on my property. It was the condition of the animal. Parts of its hide were missing, not torn or chewed, but almost plucked, like someone had deliberately removed patches of fur from its flank and shoulders. There wasn't much blood, which was strange. The ground wasn't saturated like you'd expect if it had been killed there. The deer's eyes were open, glazed over with that milky film of death, but it couldn't have been dead for long. I crouched down to examine it closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it had been hit by a car and dragged itself here to die. But the neck break was too severe for that. A cougar, perhaps. We do get them occasionally, but cougars don't typically leave their kills so exposed, and they certainly don't pluck fur. I was so absorbed in my investigation that I didn't immediately register the sound. It started as a low shuffling, then the distinct crunch of heavy footsteps on fallen leaves and twigs coming from behind the barn. My first thought was that someone was trespassing, maybe a hunter tracking the wounded deer. I stood up, ready to confront whoever it was. That's when I saw it. From around the corner of the barn emerged something that my brain couldn't immediately process. It was tall. God, it was so tall. At least 8 feet, probably more. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, matted in places with what looked like mud or tree sap. The hair wasn't uniform, thicker in some areas, particularly around the shoulders and chest, thinner around what I could only describe as its face. But calling it a face doesn't really capture what I saw. Its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with almost no discernible neck. Under a heavy brow ridge were 2 eyes, deep-set and dark, but unmistakably aware. The nose was wide and flat, more like a gorilla's than a human's, and below that, a mouth set in what looked like a permanent grimace, revealing teeth that seemed too large for even that massive jaw. Its body was impossibly broad, with shoulders that must have been twice the width of mine. The arms were long, unnaturally long, hanging down almost to its knees, and its hands. I'll never forget those hands. They were enormous, with fingers that seemed both powerful and strangely dexterous. I stood there, completely frozen. My body understood before my mind did that I was in the presence of something dangerous, something that didn't belong in my understanding of the world. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The creature, I can only call it a Sasquatch now, though I've never believed in such things, moved with purpose toward the dead deer. It didn't rush or sneak. It moved like something that had absolutely no fear of me or anything else. With one of those massive hands, it reached down and grabbed the buck by its hind leg, its fingers wrapped completely around the deer's leg with room to spare. Then, without any apparent effort, it lifted the deer, a buck that must have weighed at least 200 pounds, as if it were picking up a shopping bag. No strain, no readjustment of its stance, just raw, terrifying strength. That's when it noticed me. It turned its head slightly, and those eyes, those intelligent, calculating eyes, fixed on me. There was no fear in that gaze, no surprise. If anything, it looked annoyed, like I was a minor inconvenience it hadn't factored into its plans. It let out a breath then, a deep, rumbling exhale that wasn't quite a growl, but carried more weight than a sigh. The sound vibrated in my chest, and I could smell its breath from where I stood, maybe 15 feet away, a musty, earthy smell mixed with something metallic and raw. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think clearly. My body was locked in place by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. This thing could kill me with minimal effort, and we both knew it. Then, still holding the deer with one hand, it turned away from me and began walking toward the tree line at the back of my property. Its gait was strange, fluid but powerful, covering ground with each step that would take me 3 or 4 strides. The way it moved didn't match anything I've seen before, not human, not bear, not any animal I know. I remained frozen until it reached the trees, about 50 yards from where I stood. Just before entering the forest, it paused and looked back at me once more. I swear there was intelligence in that look, a clear communication that transcended language. It was sizing me up, deciding whether I was a threat or worth the trouble. Apparently I wasn't either, because it turned back toward the forest and disappeared among the trees, the dead deer still dangling from its grip. I don't know how long I stood there after it was gone. The temperature had dropped, and the mist had turned to a light rain. But I couldn't feel it. When I finally managed to move, my legs nearly gave out. I stumbled back to my house, locked every door and window, and sat in my kitchen with every light on, clutching a knife I'd grabbed from the counter. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind in the trees outside sent my heart racing. I kept expecting to see that face peering in through my windows, those massive hands testing my doors. The next morning, I forced myself to go back to the spot behind the barn. I half expected, hoped really, to find nothing, to be able to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, but the drag marks were still there in the gravel and dirt, now partially washed away by the rain. There were no deer remains, but I found something else, a patch of coarse, dark brown hair caught on a nail protruding from the side of the barn. I collected it in a plastic bag, thinking I would have it analyzed, prove to myself and others what I'd seen, but I never did. The hair sat in my desk drawer for weeks before I finally threw it away. Who would believe me? What would I even do with confirmation? Invite researchers to stake out my property, waiting for it to return? The thought of seeing that creature again filled me with dread. In the days that followed, I noticed other things. Unusual tracks in the mud near the tree line, too large to be human. Strange, twisted branches high up in trees where no person could reach, and twice the distant sound of wood knocking against wood from deep in the forest, a hollow percussion that didn't match any woodpecker or natural sound I knew. I've since installed security cameras around my property and motion sensor lights. I rarely go out after dark anymore, and never to the back of my property alone. I've considered moving, but this is my home, and part of me doesn't want to be driven away by fear. I know how this sounds. Before that day, I would have been the first to dismiss someone else's story like this. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, these were myths, legends, misidentifications of bears or hoaxes perpetrated by attention seekers. Now, I don't know what to believe, except what I saw with my own eyes. That thing was real. It was hunting on my property. And the most terrifying part wasn't its size or strength, but the intelligence I saw in its eyes, the clear indication that it was evaluating me just as I was it. It wasn't some mindless animal. It was something else entirely, something that has likely been watching us from the shadows of our forests for centuries, while we convinced ourselves it couldn't possibly exist. I still can't explain what I saw that day. I don't know if it will ever return, or if others like it are out there. All I know is that the forests are deeper and more mysterious than we want to admit. And sometimes, when I look out my window at night toward those dark trees, I can't shake the feeling that something out there is looking back. Story 7. I've been going through this whole thing in my head for the past 2 weeks, trying to make sense of it. Still feels like I'm going crazy just thinking about it. I hunt that area all the time, but I've never seen anything like what I saw that day. It was back in early November, the first weekend of deer season in East Texas. I'd been waiting all year for this, got a decent spot on the eastern shore of Caddo Lake that's always been good to me, away from the tourist spots and the fishing areas. Been hunting there for about 7 years now. That morning I woke up at 4:30, got my gear together and drove out while it was still dark. My truck's a bit loud, old Ford F-150 that needs a new muffler, but I always park about a quarter mile from my stand just in case. I remember it was unusually cold that morning, maybe around 40 degrees, which is pretty chilly for East Texas in early November. The weather app had predicted some fog over the lake, and they weren't wrong. Got to my stand before sunrise, climbed up and settled in. It's about 15 feet up in a big oak tree with a good view of a clearing where deer often come through. I had my Remington 700 with me, thermos of coffee, some beef jerky, the usual setup. The first few hours were quiet. Saw a doe around 7, but she was too small, so I let her pass. By 11, my back was killing me, and my legs were cramping from sitting still so long. Decided to take a break and stretch my legs for a bit. That's something I don't usually do during a hunt, but I hadn't seen anything promising all morning, and I figured moving around a little wouldn't hurt. Left my rifle in the stand since I was just planning to walk around nearby. It was one of those still days, barely any wind, just the occasional bird call. The lake was like glass with this thin layer of mist hovering over it. I walked down toward the shoreline, maybe 300 yards from my stand. There's a small clearing there before the cypress trees start growing right out of the water. I was just standing there, rolling my shoulders and stretching my back when I heard this sound, like water being displaced, but not like a fish jumping. More substantial. My first thought was maybe it was a gator, though they're not usually active when it's that cold. When I turned to my left, that's when I saw it, about 50 yards away where the shoreline curves around a small inlet. At first, all I could see was movement, something large coming out of the water. The fog was still hanging over parts of the lake, so the visibility wasn't great, but what I could see didn't make any sense. This thing was emerging from the water, not swimming like a person or an animal. It was just rising up, like it had been standing in the water. The water was probably chest deep on it, and as it moved toward the shore, more of its body became visible. I remember thinking it must be a bear. Had to be, but the way it moved wasn't right. It paused at the water's edge, and I swear to God it looked both ways, like someone checking for traffic before crossing a street. That's when it hit me that this thing was standing completely upright. It wasn't a bear. Bears can stand on their hind legs, sure, but they don't walk that way, and they have this hunched posture. This thing was standing straight up, with proportions more like a person, but much, much bigger. I couldn't move. I just stood there, half hidden behind a cypress tree, watching. The creature took a few steps onto the shore, and I could see it better now. It was covered in dark hair or fur. Not black, more like a dark brown or reddish brown. It's hard to judge size when you're scared shitless, but it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The build was massive, broad shoulders, thick limbs, not fat but solid, like a linebacker on steroids. The thing that keeps sticking with me is how it moved. There was nothing awkward about it. It walked with purpose, deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going, and it was quiet. Something that big should make noise walking through the woods, but it moved with this eerie silence. After looking around, it just walked straight into the tree line and disappeared into the woods. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like time had stopped. I stood there for I don't know how long, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept thinking, maybe it was just some guy in a suit. But that didn't make any sense either. Who would be out in Caddo Lake in November? in a costume, just to scare some random hunter. And the way it moved, no one could fake that. Finally, I snapped out of it and realized I was alone in the woods with whatever that thing was. My truck was parked in the direction it had gone. My rifle was back in the stand. I had my pistol on my hip, a Glock 20 I carry for hogs and emergencies, but it suddenly felt completely inadequate. I decided to wait a while before heading back, hoping the creature would move deeper into the woods. After about 15 minutes of standing there, listening to every little sound in the forest, I started making my way back toward my stand, taking a wide path to avoid the area where the thing had entered the woods. I was walking slowly, scanning constantly, when I came across this patch of loose soil about halfway back to my stand. Something made me stop and look down, and that's when I saw the footprint. Jesus, that footprint. I've been hunting for 20 years. I know what animal tracks look like. I know what human footprints look like. This was neither. It was enormous, had to be 18 inches long at least, and incredibly wide. You could see 5 distinct toes, bigger than human toes, and it was sunk deep into the dirt, which meant whatever left it was heavy. I took out my phone to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so bad I had to try 3 times. I still have the photo, but it doesn't really capture how disturbing it was in person. You can see the basic shape, but you can't tell how deep it was, how fresh it looked. Looking at that footprint, I couldn't deny what I'd seen anymore. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't a guy in a suit. This was something else entirely. I practically ran back to my stand, grabbed my rifle, and got the hell out of there, taking a different route to my truck than I normally would. The whole time I felt like I was being watched. Every branch breaking in the distance made me freeze. Every rustle in the underbrush had me raising my rifle. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't even field dress the small buck I'd shot the previous evening that was hanging at my camp, just packed up and left. On the drive home, I kept trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear after all, and the weird angle made it look like it was walking upright. Maybe the footprint was just some kind of weird erosion pattern or multiple tracks overlapping. But I knew I was just trying to convince myself. I've been back to Caddo Lake plenty of times before this happened. I know the wildlife there. We've got deer, wild hogs, the occasional bear passing through, coyotes, bobcats, normal Texas wildlife. What I saw wasn't any of those things. Since then, I've done some research online. Turns out there have been other sightings around Caddo Lake over the years. People talk about a creature they call the Caddo Critter, or sometimes tie it to Bigfoot sightings. I always thought those people were nuts or attention seekers. Now, I'm not so sure. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, and she believes me, but most would think I'm crazy or was drinking in my stand. I wasn't. Haven't touched alcohol while hunting since a stupid mistake in my 20s. The thing that keeps eating at me is the deliberateness of its movements. The way it checked to make sure the coast was clear before coming ashore. The purposeful way it walked. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was intelligence there, and that scares me more than anything. I've been back to hunt since then, but not in that same spot. Can't bring myself to go there. I stick to the western side of the lake now, and I never hunt alone anymore. Always bring a buddy, and I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, watching the water. I don't know what I saw that day at Caddo Lake. I can't explain it. All I know is that it was real, it was massive, and it didn't belong in those woods. Or maybe it did, and we're the ones who don't belong. Either way, I can't shake the feeling that there are things out in those swamps that we're not supposed to know about, things that have been there long before us, and will be there long after we're gone. That footprint haunts my dreams. I keep seeing those 5 toes pressed into the dirt, the massive weight that must have created it. And I keep wondering, if that thing wanted to, how fast could it have closed that 50 yards between us? And what would have happened if it had? Story 8, Biggie. I still wake up in a cold sweat sometimes. It's been almost 9 years since that night on Mount Rainier, but I can't shake it. I've been an avid outdoorsman my entire life. Grew up hunting, fishing, hiking, you name it. I thought I knew the wilderness and its creatures. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It was August 2014. My buddy Mike and I had been planning this trip for months. We're both experienced campers and wanted to get away from the regular hiking trails and campgrounds. Find somewhere remote, peaceful, away from all the tourists. We chose a high ridge near Mount Rainier, somewhere with no designated trails. We'd been there once before a few years back and remembered a perfect flat spot with an amazing view of the surrounding forest. The kind of place where you feel like the only humans for miles. We hiked most of the day, taking our time, enjoying the scenery. It was hot that August, mid-80s with clear skies. We reached our spot around 4 in the afternoon. It was exactly as I remembered, a relatively flat area on the ridge with a perfect view of the tree line below us. We could see for miles, the dense forest stretching out before us. We set up camp, nothing fancy, just our 2-person tent, our gear, and a small fire pit we made with rocks. For dinner, we cooked some steaks on our portable grill, had a few beers, and watched the sunset. It was perfect. The stars that night were incredible. No light pollution, just the Milky Way sprawled across the sky. We hung our food bags on a branch about 12 feet up to keep any bears or other critters away. Standard procedure when you're out in the wilderness. Everything was textbook perfect. We turned in around 11. I remember checking my watch because Mike was giving me crap about going to bed so early. "We're in the middle of nowhere and you're still on a schedule," he joked. If only we'd known what was coming, we might have hiked back down that evening. I woke up suddenly. My watch read 2:03 a.m. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then it hit me. The silence. If you've spent time in the woods at night, you know they're never truly silent. There's always something. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling, the occasional owl. But this was different. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire forest. Then I heard it. Breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. Right outside our tent. My first thought was bear, but it didn't sound right. The breathing was too deliberate, too controlled, and it was moving, circling our tent slowly. I nudged Mike awake, putting my hand over his mouth before he could speak. His eyes went wide when he heard it too. We sat there, completely frozen, listening as this thing circled our tent. The breathing grew louder, closer, then suddenly stopped. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then something hit our tent with such force that the entire structure shook. It wasn't a paw swipe or a curious nudge. It was a deliberate strike, like someone had punched the side of the tent with tremendous force. The shock of it made me gasp, and I heard Mike curse under his breath. That's when things got worse. Whatever was out there started circling faster, pounding on the tent walls as it moved. Each impact made the tent shudder, and the growls. Jesus, the growls. They weren't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a cougar, not any animal I knew. They were deep, deep, guttural sounds that seemed to vibrate through the tent fabric and into my chest. With each step it took, I could feel the ground shake beneath me. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with any normal wildlife. This thing was massive, heavy enough that its footfalls made the earth tremble. Mike was fumbling for his flashlight, but I grabbed his arm to stop him. Some primal instinct told me that drawing attention to ourselves would make things worse. We needed to stay still, stay quiet, and hope this thing lost interest. The direct pounding eventually stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe it was leaving. Then I heard the crack of breaking wood. Something was snapping branches, thick ones from the sound of it. Suddenly a heavy object struck a tree right next to our tent with a loud thwack. Then another and another. This thing was breaking off branches and throwing them at us, at the trees around us. It was trying to scare us, intimidate us, and it was working. For what felt like hours, this continued. The creature would pace around our campsite, occasionally rushing toward the tent with loud, aggressive grunts that made my heart feel like it would explode, then retreat back to the tree line. It was toying with us, testing us. I've encountered predators before, bears, mountain lions, but they either attack or they don't. They don't play psychological games. Mike and I barely moved or spoke. We'd occasionally whisper to each other, confirming we were both still conscious, still sane. "What the fuck is that thing?" Mike kept asking. I had no answer, though deep down I think we both knew. We just couldn't bring ourselves to say it out loud. At one point I heard our food bags drop to the ground. Whatever this creature was, it was tall enough to reach 12 feet up, and strong enough to break the branch or untie our knots. I heard it rummaging through our supplies, tearing open packages, grunting in what sounded almost like satisfaction. The worst part was the waiting for it to either leave or tear open our tent. Waiting to see if we'd make it to morning. Every minute felt like an hour. I kept checking my watch, 3:15, 4:22, 5:05. As the first hint of dawn appeared, the woods went completely silent again, that unnatural silence from before. We waited another hour before we dared to move. Neither of us said it, but we both knew we needed daylight. Whatever was out there seemed to prefer the darkness. When we finally emerged from our tent around 6:30, the scene around us looked like a tornado had hit it. Our tent was torn in several places, long gashes in the fabric that couldn't have been made by claws. Our gear was scattered everywhere. The food bags were completely gone, not just knocked down, but taken. And then there were the footprints. All around our campsite, pressed deep into the soil, were large humanoid footprints. I've been a hunter all my life. I know what human tracks look like, and I know what bear tracks look like. These were neither. They were enormous, easily over 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and a shape that was unmistakably like a human foot, just massive. The stride length between them was incredible, suggesting whatever made them was not only huge, but could cover ground quickly. We didn't say much as we packed up what remained of our gear. There was an unspoken agreement that we needed to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. We didn't even bother with breakfast. We just stuffed everything into our packs and started hiking back down. We were about an hour into our descent when we heard it, one final roar echoing through the forest. It was distant but distinct, carrying over the trees like a warning. Don't come back. Mike and I have talked about that night many times since then. We've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away. Could it have been a bear, a mountain lion, some other known predator? But neither of us believes that. We're both experienced outdoorsmen. We know the wilderness and its inhabitants. What happened that night was something else entirely. The calculated nature of it is what still haunts me. The way it circled us, tested us, tried to intimidate us. The way it used tools, breaking branches to throw at us. The intelligence behind those actions wasn't animal-like. It was deliberate, conscious. Mike hasn't been camping since, not once in 9 years. He sold all his gear and now limits his outdoor activities to day hikes in popular areas. As for me, I still go out, but never without my sidearm, and never to remote locations. And I've never gone back to Mount Rainier. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to put a name to it, though I think we all know what it probably was. All I know is that there are things in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do, and sometimes if you venture too far from the beaten path, you might just encounter them. To this day, I can still hear that breathing, still feel the vibration of those growls in my chest, still see those massive footprints in the dirt, and I know with absolute certainty that we were being hunted that night, not by an animal, but by something else, something that wanted us to know we were in its territory and we weren't welcome. Story 9. I never believed in this stuff, never. I used to laugh at those shows where people go out in the woods with night vision goggles looking for Bigfoot. I'd roll my eyes whenever my buddy Mike would talk about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. But that was before March of 2022. Now, I don't know what to believe anymore. I live in White County, Georgia, about 15 miles outside of Cleveland. I've got this little 3-acre property that backs up to national forest land. Nothing fancy, just a modest ranch house with a big yard that I've been slowly turning into a decent-sized vegetable garden. After 2 years of COVID and all the supply chain issues, I figured growing my own food wasn't the worst idea. That spring, I expanded my garden plot significantly, spent a whole weekend tilling up new ground, working in compost, planting rows of carrots, potatoes, squash, tomatoes, peppers, you name it. I was pretty proud of myself, to be honest. I even put up this little fence to keep the deer out, though it was more of a visual barrier than anything substantial. The trouble started about 3 weeks after I planted everything. I went out one morning to check on the garden and noticed something had been digging around my carrot rows. At first I assumed it was raccoons or maybe a groundhog. The damage wasn't terrible, just a few plants disturbed and what looked like something had been pulling up the young carrots. I reinforced the fence a bit and figured that would take care of it, but the next morning, same thing. More carrots pulled up, and this time some of my squash plants had been damaged too. Whatever was getting in was persistent. I noticed the fence wasn't broken, just pushed down in one spot like something heavy had stepped over it. That's when I started thinking it might be a bear. We get black bears around here sometimes, and they're not afraid to raid gardens. I decided I'd need to keep a closer eye on things. 4 days later, around 6 in the morning, I was having coffee on my back deck when I saw movement at the edge of my property where the trees start. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a deer, but as I focused, I realized it was something much bigger. Standing there, partially obscured by a pine tree, was what I can only describe as a large, upright figure. It was just watching from about 100 yards away. My first thought was that someone was on my property, but something felt off. The proportions weren't right. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive. Way taller than any person I know. I stayed absolutely still, not even lifting my coffee cup. The figure stepped slightly out from behind the tree, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. This thing was covered in dark hair. Not clothes, not a hunting outfit, actual hair, from head to toe. It had this distinctly human-like shape, but with wider shoulders and longer arms than a normal person. As I watched, barely breathing, it walked on 2 legs toward my garden. Its movement was fluid, not awkward or costume-like. It reached the edge of my garden, squatted down, and began digging in the soil with its hands, pulling up my young carrots and eating them. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My hands were shaking so bad, I had to set my coffee down before I dropped it. The creature, and I don't know what else to call it, was methodically harvesting my garden like it knew exactly what it was doing. Then the wind shifted, and I caught a whiff of something that made my nose wrinkle, a strong, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something more pungent. I'd later learned that this smell is commonly reported in Bigfoot encounters. I didn't approach it or make any noise to scare it away. Some instinct told me to just stay put and observe. After about 10 minutes of eating carrots and some of my young squash plants, the creature stood up to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, looked around cautiously, and then walked back to the tree line with surprising quietness for something so big. Once it disappeared into the trees, I practically collapsed in my chair, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? I spent the rest of the day in a daze, questioning my own sanity. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But it came back. 2 days later, early evening this time, just before sunset. Same routine. It emerged from the trees, went straight to the garden, and helped itself to more vegetables. This time, I watched from my kitchen window, and I could see it more clearly in the evening light. Its hair was dark brown, almost black, covering its entire body. The face was partially hidden by the hair, but what I could see looked like a cross between human and ape features. A pronounced brow, deep-set eyes, a wide nose. Over the next few weeks, it established a pattern. It would visit every few days, usually in the early morning or evening, and always went straight for the garden. It seemed to favor the carrots and squash above all else. I started planting extra, figuring I might as well share my harvest with my unusual visitor. I began keeping a journal of the visits, noting times, behavior, what it ate. The creature was cautious during daylight hours, but seemed bolder in the evening. Sometimes in late afternoon, I'd catch glimpses of it moving along the edge of my property, as if scouting to see if it was safe to approach the garden. Despite its size, it moved with surprising stealth. The only time I ever heard it make noise was when my neighbor's dog started barking furiously one evening, and the creature made this deep, guttural sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, before quickly retreating to the woods. The most unsettling encounter happened in late May. I was getting ready for bed, around 11 at night. I'd just turned off the TV and was about to brush my teeth when I felt this presence. It's hard to explain, but it was like that feeling when you know someone's watching you. I turned toward my bedroom window, and there it was. Its face right there, peering in from outside. My bedroom is on the first floor, but the windowsill is still about 4 feet off the ground. This thing was tall enough to look in comfortably. Our eyes met, and for a few seconds, neither of us moved. Its eyes reflected the dim light from my bedside lamp, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to be studying me with as much curiosity as I had about it. Then, as if deciding I wasn't a threat, it simply moved away from the window and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. Having it approach the house crossed a line that made me extremely uncomfortable. The garden was one thing, but this felt invasive, too close. The next day, I installed motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter of my house. That seemed to deter it from approaching the building again, but it didn't stop the garden visits. If anything, it became more careful, staying in the shadows where possible. By early June, I'd gone from terrified to cautiously fascinated. I set up a trail camera near the garden, hoping to get photographic evidence of what I was seeing. The first few nights yielded nothing, but on the fourth night, I captured something. Blurry images of an upright, hairy figure near my squash plants. The pictures weren't great, typical of Bigfoot photos you see online, which was frustrating because the creature was so clearly visible to me in person. Throughout the summer, the visits continued, usually once or twice a week. It never took everything, just a few vegetables each time, almost like it was being considerate not to clean me out. Sometimes it would leave unusual arrangements of sticks or rocks near the garden, which I later read might be some kind of territorial or communication markers. I've only told a handful of close friends about this. My buddy Mike, the one who was always into cryptids, came to stay with me for a weekend in July, hoping to see it himself. Of course, during those 2 days, no sign of my visitor. Mike was disappointed but believed my account, especially after seeing the trail cam photos and the consistent damage to specific parts of my garden. It's been almost 5 months now since the first sighting, and the visits continue, though less frequently as the weather gets colder and the garden produces less. I've started leaving vegetables out at the edge of the property, and they're always gone by morning. I still struggle with what I'm experiencing. Some days I convince myself it must be an unusually intelligent bear, or maybe someone playing an elaborate prank. But then I remember the way it moves, its eyes, its clearly deliberate behavior, and I know this is something else entirely. I'm not looking to convince anyone or become some Bigfoot celebrity. I just needed to document this somewhere, to tell someone who might understand or have had similar experiences. Maybe these creatures are more common than we think, quietly existing alongside us, usually unseen, Maybe as humans push further into their territories, these kinds of encounters will become more common. All I know is that my understanding of what's possible has completely changed. I no longer laugh at those Bigfoot shows. I no longer dismiss other people's unusual encounters, and I plant extra carrots now because apparently Bigfoot really likes them. Story 10. I've never been a superstitious man. My work as a surveyor requires precision, facts, and measurements. The natural world operates by rules and patterns. That's what I built my career on. Or at least, that's what I believed until October of 1912. It's taken me months to work up the courage to write this down. My colleagues think I've been distracted lately. My wife says I wake up sweating some nights. But how do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you process seeing something that changes everything you thought you knew about this continent? I am Phillips Mills, a surveyor from Melbourne. I was commissioned last autumn to conduct preliminary work in the mountains near Bega in New South Wales. The government was considering some new development in the region, typical bureaucratic nonsense that required mapping and geological assessments. Nothing extraordinary. I brought along 2 geologists, Thomas Freeman and Robert Wallace, both respected men in their field with impeccable reputations. I mention this because I need whoever reads this to understand that we aren't the type of men prone to fantasy or exaggeration. We're scientists, observers, men who trade in facts. The journey to the mountain site took 3 days by horse. The weather was pleasant enough, crisp autumn air that bit at your cheeks in the morning but warmed as the day progressed. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as we ascended, dense eucalyptus forests giving way to rocky outcroppings. By late afternoon on the 3rd day, we'd reached our designated survey point about halfway up the eastern slope. We made camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering gum trees. The site offered a decent vantage point for our work, with a stream nearby for water. Thomas and Robert immediately set about collecting rock samples, while I established our base point markers. Everything proceeded as normal until evening fell. I've replayed what happened that night thousands of times in my mind, questioning every detail, wondering if there was something I missed or misinterpreted. But no matter how many times I review it, the core of what we experienced remains unexplainable. We had finished setting up our tents and built a modest campfire. The flames cast long shadows through the trees as darkness settled over the mountain. Robert had prepared a simple meal of salt beef, beans, and bread. We sat around the fire, discussing the day's findings and planning tomorrow's work. The conversation was mundane: geological formations, potential mineral deposits, survey lines. I remember checking my pocket watch. It was just after 8 in the evening. The forest had grown quiet, except for the occasional call of a night bird. The air had turned chilly, and we huddled closer to the fire. Thomas was in the middle of explaining a curious rock formation he'd discovered when I noticed something off. It wasn't a sound exactly, more a feeling, like when you sense someone watching you. I glanced up from the fire, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, a dark shape moving between the trees at the edge of our camp. At first, I thought it might be a large kangaroo or perhaps a wild dog. But something about the way it moved seemed wrong, too deliberate, too upright. "Do you see that?" I whispered, nodding toward the darkness beyond our campfire. Thomas and Robert followed my gaze, squinting into the shadows. "I don't see anything," Thomas muttered, but his body tensed. He felt it too. We fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and our shallow breathing. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. I began to think I'd imagined it when suddenly the shape moved again, closer this time, partially illuminated by the firelight. My blood ran cold. What stood at the edge of our camp was neither man nor any animal I recognized. It was tall, remarkably tall, standing at least 7 feet high. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, with powerful arms that hung longer than a man's should. Even in the dim light, I could see the massive muscles that rippled beneath its coat as it moved. "Good God!" Robert gasped beside me. The creature stepped forward, now fully within the circle of firelight. I'll never forget what I saw. Its face was wrong. Not quite human, not quite ape, but some unsettling combination of both. Deep-set eyes reflected the firelight like a predator's. Its jaw was heavy and pronounced, but there was something undeniably intelligent in its gaze as it observed us. None of us moved. I couldn't have run if I'd wanted to. My legs felt rooted to the ground. The creature seemed equally curious about us. It tilted its head slightly, studying our camp with what I can only describe as deliberate interest. Its hands were enormous, easily twice the size of mine, with thick fingers that looked capable of crushing stone. Its feet were similarly massive, leaving indentations in the soft earth that I would later measure at nearly 16 inches in length. I can't say how long we stayed locked in this silent standoff. Time seemed to stretch and distort. I was acutely aware of every sound, the fire crackling, an owl hooting in the distance, Thomas's ragged breathing beside me. Robert was the first to break the spell. Slowly, his hand moved toward his pack, where I knew he kept his service revolver. I don't think he intended to shoot the creature. More likely he wanted some measure of security in this impossible situation. But the movement caught the creature's attention. Its eyes, so human-like despite everything else, flicked to Robert's hand. There was recognition there, an understanding that sent chills through me. This thing knew what a weapon was. It understood the threat. Yet instead of charging or fleeing as a wild animal might, it simply straightened to its full height, its chest expanding as it drew a deep breath. The display was unmistakable, a silent communication that it was not afraid of us or our weapons. When Robert's fingers closed around the handle of his revolver, I found my voice. "Don't," I said, barely above a whisper. "Please don't." I can't explain why I stopped him. Something in the creature's demeanor, perhaps. It wasn't threatening us. It was observing, assessing. There was a sentience there that made the idea of shooting it feel wrong, profoundly wrong. Robert hesitated, looking at me with confusion. In that moment of distraction, the creature simply turned and walked away. Not in panic or haste, but with deliberate, powerful strides that carried it quickly beyond the firelight and into the darkness of the forest. We listened as it moved through the underbrush, the sound growing fainter until it disappeared entirely. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. "What in God's name was that?" Thomas whispered, his face ashen in the firelight. None of us had an answer. We stayed awake the entire night, keeping the fire burning high, our backs to each other as we faced outward into the darkness. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow seemed to move. When dawn finally broke, we debated what to do. The practical choice would have been to pack up and return to civilization. But we were scientists at heart, and the need to understand what we'd seen warmed as the terror of the night receded. Against my better judgment, we decided to investigate. After a tense breakfast, we followed the direction the creature had taken. It wasn't difficult to track. Its footprints were clearly visible in the soft forest floor, unlike anything I'd ever documented. I made careful measurements and sketches in my field journal, trying to maintain some semblance of scientific objectivity despite my racing heart. The prints led us deeper into the forest, up a steep incline that eventually opened into a rocky shelf overlooking a deep valley. The tracks disappeared on the hard stone, but something else caught our attention. In a crevice between two large boulders, we found what appeared to be a temporary shelter. Branches had been deliberately arranged to create a windbreak. The ground inside showed signs of recent use. Compressed earth, a few dark hairs that matched what we'd seen on the creature, but what truly disturbed me were the arrangements of stones nearby. 7 small piles of rocks, carefully stacked in a pattern that couldn't possibly be natural. Each stack contained exactly 5 stones, balanced with precision that spoke of purpose and intelligence. Robert discovered something else. Scratches in the soft sandstone of the rock face, not random animal marks, but deliberate patterns, simple geometric shapes, circles, triangles, lines, crude but unmistakably intentional. We stood there in silence, the implications washing over us. Whatever we had encountered wasn't just some unknown animal. It was something that created shelter, that arranged objects in patterns, that made marks with meaning. Thomas was the first to speak. We need to report this. The scientific community needs to know. Robert nodded eagerly. We have evidence, the footprint measurements, these structures, the markings. This could be the discovery of the century. But as I stood there, a strange feeling settled over me. I thought about how the creature had simply observed us, how it had walked away when it could have attacked. I thought about the fear in its eyes when Robert reached for his gun. Yes, fear, but also resignation, as if it had experienced human violence before. No, I said finally. They both turned to me in shock. What do you mean, no? Thomas demanded. I gestured around us. Look at this place. It's remote, untouched. If we report this, what happens next? Expeditions, hunters, men with guns coming to capture or kill it. Is that what we want? It's our duty as scientists, Robert argued, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. Our duty to what? To whom? I countered. Whatever that was, it showed intelligence, awareness. It observed us and chose to leave us in peace. Don't we owe it the same courtesy? The debate continued as we made our way back to camp. By afternoon, we'd reached a compromise. We would complete our survey work as planned, but we would not include any mention of the creature in our official reports. We would, however, document everything we'd observed in private journals, to be sealed and only opened under specific circumstances we all agreed upon. That night, we kept a vigilant watch, but the creature never returned. In the morning, we packed up our equipment and began the journey back to civilization. None of us spoke much during the 3-day trek. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. It's been 3 months since that day in the mountains. I've not spoken of it to anyone except Thomas and Robert, who have kept their word about our agreement. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if perhaps the isolation of the wilderness played tricks on our minds. But then I open my field journal and see the detailed measurements of those 16-inch footprints. I see my sketches of those stone arrangements, and I remember the intelligence in those eyes as they met mine across the campfire. I don't know what we saw that night in the mountains near Bega. I don't know if there are more of them out there, living secretly in the wild places humans rarely visit. What I do know is that the world is bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than I ever imagined. And some discoveries, perhaps, are better left unreported. The Australian wilderness holds secrets. I've seen one of them with my own eyes, and it has changed me forever. Story 11. I still have a hard time talking about this, even though it's been 16 years. I've lurked in this community for years, reading everyone else's experiences, but I've never shared mine until now. I think I'm finally ready. It was August of 2007. I'd been working a soul-crushing office job in Portland for about 3 years, and I desperately needed to get away from people for a bit. I've always been an outdoorsy guy, grew up hunting with my dad in eastern Oregon, so I decided to take a solo camping trip to Mount Hood National Forest. Nothing extreme, just a few days of peace and quiet. I packed pretty light: tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, water filter, and my trusty .306 rifle. I've always carried it when camping alone, mostly for peace of mind, and occasionally for hunting when in season. That rifle ended up being the only thing that kept me sane through what happened. I drove out early on a Tuesday morning, took Forest Service Road 44 deep into the woods, and parked at this little pull-off that hardly anyone uses. From there, I hiked about 2 miles in, following this faint game trail that ran alongside a small creek. I wasn't using any established campgrounds. I wanted actual solitude. The spot I found was perfect. A small clearing about 30 yards from the creek, surrounded by massive Douglas firs and hemlocks. Some of these trees must have been hundreds of years old. The forest floor was covered in moss and ferns, and there was this peaceful vibe to the whole area. I set up my tent, built a small fire pit, and spent the afternoon filtering water and gathering firewood. That first night was exactly what I needed. I cooked some food over the fire, had a couple beers I'd packed in, and just listened to the sounds of the forest. The stars were incredible. You forget how many there are when you live in the city. I fell asleep to the gentle sound of the creek. The second day, I hiked around exploring the area, following the creek upstream for a few miles before heading back to camp. I saw some deer tracks, lots of birds, even spotted a hawk catching something in a meadow. I felt completely at peace. Then came the second night. I had dinner, put out my fire around 9, and crawled into my tent. It was a clear night, slightly cooler than the previous one. I was reading with my headlamp for maybe half an hour before deciding to call it a night. I turned off the light and settled into my sleeping bag, listening to the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves in the light breeze. I was just drifting off when I heard it. Snapping sounds in the trees about 40 or 50 yards away. Not the sound of a twig breaking underfoot, but like something was deliberately breaking small branches. Snap, then a pause. Snap, another pause. At first I thought it was probably just a deer or elk moving through the underbrush. But then the sounds started moving in a clear pattern, circling the perimeter of my campsite. Whatever it was moving with purpose. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that made the ground vibrate slightly. Not the light steps of a deer or even the plodding of a black bear. These were powerful, methodical, and they were circling my campsite, keeping about the same distance. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart starting to pound. I reached for my flashlight, but then stopped myself. Something told me I didn't want to attract attention. Instead, I quietly reached for my rifle, which I'd kept beside my sleeping bag. The footsteps continued their circle. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause, like it was taking careful, measured steps. I estimated whatever it was had to be big, really big, based on how the ground shook slightly with each step. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold. About 30 yards from my tent, one of the trees, a decent-sized hemlock, began violently shaking. Not swaying in the wind, but shaking like something was physically grabbing it and rattling it with incredible force. I could hear the wood creaking and groaning, branches thrashing against other trees. There was no wind, nothing that could explain what I was hearing. The shaking stopped abruptly, and the footsteps resumed, now moving closer to my tent. 20 yards, 15, 10. I could hear breathing now, deep, controlled breathing that didn't sound like any animal I recognized, not the huffing of a bear or the snorting of an elk. This was slow, deliberate, almost human-like, but deeper and more powerful. Whatever it was circled my tent once, close enough that if I had reached out and touched the tent wall, it would have been just on the other side. I was frozen, my hands sweating around the stock of my rifle. I've never considered myself religious, but I was praying to anything that might be listening. Then it stopped, directly in front of my tent door. I could see the shadow it cast by the moonlight, massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders. It just stood there, breathing, in, out, each breath making the hair on my neck stand up. Suddenly, something pushed against the side of my tent, hard enough that my cookware toppled over with a clatter. It wasn't an accidental brush, it was deliberate, like it was testing the tent, testing me. I raised my rifle, pointing it at the tent wall where the shadow stood, my finger hovering near the trigger. I don't know what good it would have done. I couldn't see what I was aiming at, and firing blindly seemed like a terrible idea, but it was all I had. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, slowly, the footsteps began again, circling once more around my tent. When it reached the edge of the clearing, I heard the loud snap of a branch breaking, not a small twig, but something substantial. Then silence for about 5 seconds. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. The thing charged from the edge of the clearing straight toward my tent at incredible speed. The ground shook with each impact of its feet. I raised my rifle, certain I was about to die. But then, just before it would have crashed into my tent, it stopped. Dead stop. It stood there so close I could hear its breathing, heavy from the charge. 1 second, 2, 5, 10. Just standing there, breathing, as if deciding what to do with me. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. Back toward the trees, into the forest, the sound growing fainter until all I could hear was my own heart pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep. Not a single minute. I sat there, rifle ready, jumping at every sound until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. Only then did I dare unzip my tent and peek outside. Everything looked normal at first glance. The forest, the clearing, my camp set up. But then I noticed details that made my stomach clench. The hemlock tree I'd heard shaking had long strips of bark torn from its trunk, about 7 feet up from the ground. The forest floor around my tent had these huge scuff marks, like something heavy had dragged its feet. And about 30 yards away, at the edge of the clearing, was a freshly broken branch. Not a small one, but a substantial limb about as thick as my wrist, snapped clean off a fir tree. I didn't bother with breakfast. I didn't even boil water for coffee. I packed my gear faster than I ever had before, constantly looking over my shoulder, checking the tree line. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely roll up my sleeping bag. As I was about to leave, something made me walk over to that broken branch. Beside it, pressed into a patch of soft earth, was a footprint. A single, enormous footprint. It was maybe 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. It wasn't a bear track. It wasn't anything I recognized. I practically ran those 2 miles back to my truck. The entire time, I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I kept looking back, kept my rifle ready. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped in the cab, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I looked in my rearview mirror at the forest I was leaving behind. For a split second, just a heartbeat, I thought I saw something. A large, dark figure standing between 2 distant trees, watching me go. But I blinked, and it was gone. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was my imagination running wild in the darkness. But deep down, I know what I experienced wasn't normal. Whatever was outside my tent that night could have killed me easily. It was powerful enough, fast enough, but it didn't. It tested me, terrified me, and then let me go. I haven't been camping alone since. I can barely bring myself to go into densely wooded areas at all anymore. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I can hear those methodical footsteps circling my house. I don't know what was in those woods with me. I don't want to know. But whatever it was intelligent. It was deliberate, and even though it's been 16 years, I still feel like it's out there waiting. Story 12. I've never really told this story to many people, and those I have told either think I'm crazy or making it up, but I swear on everything I care about that what I'm about to share is true. It happened to me. Twice. The first time was back in '69 when I was in 2nd grade. I grew up in Kalamazoo County, Michigan, in a small house that backed up to a wooded area not far from my elementary school. On weekends, my parents would let me walk to the school playground as long as I promised to be home before dark. It was a different time back then. Kids had more freedom to roam around without adults hovering over them. It was a crisp fall afternoon, and I remember wearing my favorite red jacket with the fuzzy collar. I'd been playing on the swings for a while but got bored, so I decided to explore the edge of the woods behind the playground. There was a little path that some of the older kids had worn down over time. I wasn't supposed to go into the woods alone, but the path looked so inviting, and I thought I'd just peek in a little ways. The trees weren't very dense at first, mostly young saplings and a few larger pines. I remember how the sunlight filtered through the branches, creating these golden patterns on the ground. The smell of pine needles and damp earth filled the air. I was playing this game where I was an explorer discovering new lands, completely lost in my imagination. I must have wandered further than I meant to because the playground sounds faded away. That's when I heard a crack of a branch somewhere ahead of me. I wasn't scared yet. I figured it was probably a deer or something. We saw them all the time around our neighborhood. I pushed forward through a thick patch of undergrowth, ducking under a large pine branch that was hanging low across the path. And that's when it happened. I literally ran smack into something solid. At first I thought it was a tree trunk, but it was warm and it moved. I stumbled backward and looked up and up and up. Standing there, holding back a massive pine limb with its right arm, was the biggest creature I'd ever seen. It was at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. I froze completely. My heart felt like it stopped for a second before pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The thing, I didn't know what to call it then, looked surprised or maybe angry at first, its face scrunched up, eyebrows drawn together. But then something changed. As it looked down at me, its expression softened. I remember thinking how human-like its face was, but also not human at all. Its skin had this reddish-brown color, like tawny leather that had been out in the sun too long, and it was covered in deep chocolate-colored fur. Not super thick like a bear's, but long and somewhat patchy in places. The fur on its face was thinner, so I could see its skin underneath. But what I remember most clearly were its eyes. They were dark, but not black, more like a deep amber brown. And they didn't look animal at all. There was something in them. Intelligence, curiosity, maybe even gentleness. They were set deep under a prominent brow ridge that made it look perpetually serious. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. I wasn't even breathing. I remember the smell, kind of musky and earthy, like wet leaves and soil, but also something else I couldn't identify. Not horrible, just wild. Then it blinked, slowly, and released the branch it had been holding back. Without making a sound, it turned and walked away, deeper into the woods. Its stride was long and strong, not the awkward shuffle you see in those fake Bigfoot videos. It moved with purpose, each step deliberate and surprisingly quiet for something so massive. I stood there for another minute, completely stunned. Then panic hit me like a truck, and I ran all the way back to the playground and then straight home. I burst through our front door, crying, and tried to tell my parents what happened, but they thought I'd just scared myself with my imagination. Dad walked back to the edge of the woods with me later, but of course, there was nothing to see by then. For years afterward, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or that I'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. Life went on. I grew up, made friends, went to school. Sometimes I'd think about that day in the woods, but I stopped talking about it after kids at school made fun of me. Even my best friends thought I was making it up. Then about 10 years later, when I was 16, it happened again. It was winter, early January '79. We'd had a heavy snow the night before, that thick, wet Michigan snow that clings to everything. I was sitting on our front porch, waiting for my friend Lisa to pick me up so we could go to the mall. My parents were at my aunt's house for dinner, so I was home alone. The sun had just set, and that blue-gray winter twilight was settling in. Our porch light was on, creating this small circle of yellow light in the growing darkness. I remember I was wearing this ridiculously inadequate jean jacket because I thought my winter coat wasn't cool enough. I was freezing, but too stubborn to go back inside. I was sitting there, arms wrapped around myself, when I heard it. A low, guttural growl from the side of the house. It wasn't like a dog or any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, almost like it was coming from something with a chest the size of a barrel. My whole body went rigid. I couldn't move. Then I heard footsteps, heavy ones, crunching in the snow along the side of our house. Slow, deliberate steps. Whatever it was big, really big. My first instinct was to run inside, but I was terrified that any movement would draw attention to me, so I just sat there, barely breathing, listening to those footsteps getting closer to the front of the house. They stopped just around the corner. I could feel it there, just out of sight. The porch steps creaked as I slowly stood up, inching toward the front door. That's when the growling stopped. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard Lisa's car turning onto our street, its headlights sweeping across the yard as she approached. In that flash of light, I saw it. A massive figure peeking around the corner of the house. It was the same creature I'd seen as a child. I was sure of it. Those same eyes, that same reddish-brown fur. Only now I was older, and I understood what I was looking at. A Sasquatch Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. Our eyes met for just a second before it pulled back around the corner. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted for Lisa's car the moment she pulled up, practically diving into the passenger seat. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, laughing at how freaked out I looked. I couldn't even speak. I just told her to drive, to get away from there. She thought I was being dramatic about something my parents had said or done. I didn't correct her. When my parents got home later that night, I was still too scared to tell them. What was I supposed to say? That the monster from my childhood imagination had come back? The next morning, though, my dad came into the kitchen looking confused. "Amanda, did you see anyone around the house last night?" he asked. My heart nearly stopped. "Why?" "There are some strange tracks in the snow along the side of the house. Too big to be a person's." I went outside with him, and there they were, massive footprints, easily 17 inches long, pressed deep into the snow. They came from the woods behind our house, circled around the side where I'd heard the growling, and then disappeared back into the tree line. My mum called a friend of hers whose husband worked for the DNR, Department of Natural Resources. He came out that afternoon to look at the prints. I remember standing on the porch, watching him take measurements and photographs. Later, he told my parents that the prints weren't a hoax. They were made by something very large and heavy, with a stride length that didn't match any known animal in Michigan. For weeks afterward, I refused to stay home alone. I kept the curtains closed all the time, especially the big living room windows that faced the woods. That's when I started thinking back to all the times I'd practiced dance routines in that living room, with those huge windows exposing me to whatever might be watching from the trees. Had it been watching me all those years? Was it the same creature I'd bumped into as a child? I've turned this over in my mind 1,000 times since then. What's strange is that I never felt threatened by it, even when it growled that night on the porch. Startled, yes. Terrified, absolutely, but not like it wanted to hurt me. More like it was checking on me. As crazy as that sounds, I've wondered if maybe, in some weird way, it had been watching over me since that day in the woods. I moved away from Michigan after high school and haven't been back to that house in years. But sometimes on winter nights when the wind makes the trees creak or when I'm walking alone near woods, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those intelligent amber-brown eyes looking back at me. I don't know what it was or why our paths crossed twice. All I know is what I saw, and no one can convince me otherwise. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there in those Kalamazoo woods, and if anyone else has seen it too. Story 13. I've never actually shared this before with anyone except my dad and one close friend, but it's been 35 years now, and I still think about it almost weekly. This happened in the summer of '88 when I was 21. I was home from my junior year at Iowa State for summer break, working on my family's farm in central Iowa, like I always did. Our farm is about 400 acres, mostly corn back then, with these windbreaks and wooded fence lines cutting through it. My grandfather bought the place in the 30s, then my dad took over, and I was supposed to be next in line. One section of our property borders this thick strip of trees, cottonwoods, elms, and these old pines that grew along a drainage ditch separating us from the old Johnson place that had been abandoned for years by that point. It was late July, crazy hot that summer. I remember my t-shirt was completely soaked through by noon. Dad and I were checking the irrigation system that afternoon because we'd been having issues with some of the lines getting clogged. We split up to cover more ground. He took the north section, and I headed toward the eastern fields that ran along that wooded strip I mentioned. The corn was doing really well that year, about 7 feet tall, thick and green, with the rows spaced just wide enough that you could walk between them without brushing the stalks. I was maybe 300 yards from the tree line, deep in the field, checking sprinkler heads. You know how corn can sometimes mess with your senses? You can't see more than a few feet in any direction, and sounds get weird in there. Sometimes it's dead quiet, and other times the wind makes the leaves brush together in this whispering way that almost sounds like voices. But there was no wind that day. None. The air was completely still, and so humid it felt like you were breathing through a wet towel. That's why I noticed the sound immediately. At first I thought maybe Dad had changed his mind and come to my section instead. But this wasn't how a person normally moves through corn rows. When you're walking, you just push forward down your row. This sound was different. It was coming from about 3 or 4 rows over from me, and whatever was making it was big enough to be pushing entire stalks aside, not just rustling the leaves at the top, but actually moving the whole plants. The sound stopped for a minute, and I stood completely still, listening. Then it started again, but now it sounded like it was stepping carefully from one row to the next, working its way toward me. I thought maybe it was a deer, but it sounded too deliberate for that. Deer bolt through, they don't methodically move row by row. I called out, "Dad, that you?" No answer. I was about to call again when the corn parted about 30 feet in front of me and something stepped into my row. My brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. For a split second, I thought it might be someone in dark clothes, maybe a hunter in one of those ghillie suits, but I knew right away that wasn't right. This thing was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as broad as mine, and I was a pretty big guy back then. Played football in high school. It was covered from head to toe in this dark brown hair, not fur exactly, more like coarse hair that caught the sunlight filtering through the corn leaves. Its body looked like an Olympic weightlifter or heavyweight wrestler, thick, solid, and clearly muscular. Its legs were proportionate to its body, long and powerful looking. The chest was extremely wide, but what I remember most clearly was its face. It had this prominent brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, making them look deep-set. The nose was broad and flat, and the jaw was square and strong-looking. Its whole head shape reminded me of those reconstructions of Neanderthals we'd studied in anthropology class the semester before. The most unsettling part was how it looked at me. Not aggressive or scared, just this calm, almost curious expression. Our eyes met, and I swear I could feel its intelligence. This wasn't an animal looking at me. There was something thinking behind those eyes. I couldn't move. I literally could not make my legs work. It felt like my heart stopped beating for those few seconds. The creature just stood there, observing me, then turned and walked back into the corn without rushing, not running away scared, not threatening, just calmly leaving. I don't know how long I stood there frozen. Probably only a minute, but it felt like hours. When I finally could move again, my legs were shaking so badly I nearly fell. I made it back to the edge of the field somehow, though I don't really remember the walk. Dad was at the truck when I got there. He took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I couldn't tell him everything. I just mumbled something about seeing something big moving in the corn rows. He assumed I'd seen a deer, or maybe even a black bear, which occasionally wandered down from Minnesota. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to convince myself I'd seen something normal, a person, a bear, anything that made sense. But I knew what I'd seen. The next morning, I went back alone. I found the exact spot where we'd had our encounter. The corn was bent down and crushed where it had stood. There was a circular area about 8 or 9 feet across where stalks were flattened, like something had sat or laid down there. The ground was dry and hard, but I could see some impressions spaced like bipedal walking, though not clear enough to call them definite tracks. I took some measurements using my boot as reference. Whatever made those partial prints had feet at least 15 inches long. For the rest of that summer, I never went into that field alone. I kept looking toward the tree line whenever I was working nearby, half expecting to see it watching me. I started carrying my dad's old 30-30 in the truck, even though I'm not sure what good it would have done. I never felt threatened during our encounter, but the sheer size of the thing was terrifying enough. I kept working on the farm during summers until I graduated, but I never saw the creature again. I'd hear strange noises sometimes at night, wood knocks or weird howls that didn't sound like coyotes, but nothing I could definitively connect to what I'd seen. It wasn't until about 7 years later that I finally told my dad the full story. We were having beers on the porch one night, and something about the quiet darkness made it easier to talk about. To my surprise, he just nodded and said, "I've seen strange things out there too, son. Never that close, though." He told me that back in the 60s, he and my grandfather had found weird footprints near that same drainage ditch. They'd also occasionally find deer carcasses that had been handled in ways that didn't make sense. Parts missing but not eaten, bones arranged oddly. They'd always just filed it under unexplained and moved on. I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've read every book on Bigfoot and watched every documentary. Some descriptions match what I saw, others don't. The creature I encountered wasn't the giant ape-like monster from the Patterson film. It looked more primitive human, I guess. Like what you'd get if you crossed a very muscular man with something ancient. I still help out at the farm sometimes, though my cousin runs it now since Dad retired. Every time I visit, I find myself staring at that tree line, wondering. The corn's been replaced with soybeans in that field, but the trees are still there, still thick and untouched. Sometimes I wonder if it still watches the farm from those woods. If it's still out there, moving silently between properties, keeping to the margins where wild spaces meet farmland. I wonder if anyone else has seen it over the years and, like me, decided it was safer not to talk about it. What bothers me most isn't the fear I felt that day. It's the questions I'll never have answers to. What was it? Where did it come from? How many of them are there? How have they remained hidden for so long? And why, of all people, did it choose to reveal itself to me for those few seconds on that hot July afternoon? I'm 35 years older now, and I still don't have a rational explanation for what I saw. All I know is that something impossible stood 30 feet away from me in a cornfield in '88, and my understanding of the world has never been the same since. Story 14. I've been holding this story in for too long. I need to get it off my chest, even though most people will probably think I'm making this up or exaggerating. I'm not. What happened that night in 2003 is why I haven't gone camping since. and why my buddy Mike and I never talk about Manitoulin Island anymore. It was early July, summer of 2003. Mike and I had been planning this fishing trip for months. We both worked construction in Toronto and needed to escape the city heat and noise. Manitoulin Island seemed perfect, remote enough to feel like we were actually getting away, but not so far that the drive would eat up our whole week off. We'd chosen a spot on the northern part of the island, about 2 miles in from any main road. There was this small inland lake that Mike's cousin had told him about, supposedly great for bass fishing and virtually untouched. No designated campgrounds, no facilities, just pure wilderness. Exactly what we wanted. The hike-in was tougher than expected. The terrain was rocky with dense forest, and we were each carrying about 50 pounds of gear: tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, food, fishing gear, the works. By the time we reached the lake, it was already mid-afternoon. We found a relatively flat clearing about 100 yards from the water's edge and set up camp. The spot was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and maple trees. Perfect spot, or so we thought. We pitched our 4-person tent, built a fire ring with rocks, and set up our little folding table and chairs. I hung our food bag about 15 feet up in a tree about 20 yards from our tent. You know, standard procedure to keep bears away. The rest of that day was exactly what we'd hoped for. We caught a few decent-sized bass, cleaned them by the lake, and cooked them over the fire with some potatoes and beer. Simple, perfect meal. The sun was setting, turning the sky this incredible orange-purple, and there wasn't another human for miles. Just us, the lake and the woods. We could actually hear ourselves think. We stayed up late drinking beers and bullshitting about work, women problems, all the usual stuff. The fire was still going pretty good when we finally decided to turn in around midnight. We were both beat from the hike and planned to be up early for fishing, so we just let the fire burn down to embers instead of putting it out completely. That was probably our first mistake. I remember checking my watch before falling asleep. It was just after midnight. The temperature had dropped, but it was comfortable in our sleeping bags. I fell asleep almost instantly. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when it started. My watch said 2:23 when I finally looked at it, but we'd already been awake for several minutes by then. What woke us was this crashing sound, like something had knocked over our camp table. At first, I thought maybe a raccoon or something had wandered in, attracted by any food scraps we might have missed. "Mike, you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah, probably just a raccoon," he whispered back, echoing my thoughts. Then we heard another crash, louder this time. One of our chairs had been knocked over, then another. Whatever was out there, it wasn't small. "That's not a fucking raccoon," Mike said, his voice tight. We both sat up in our sleeping bags, straining to hear. The fire had died down to almost nothing, so there was barely any light coming through the tent walls. The moon was only a quarter full that night, casting just enough light to make shadows seem deeper. That's when we heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. Not four-legged like a bear or deer. These were bipedal, 2 feet, walking, slowly circling us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Neither of us said a word. We just sat there, frozen, listening to whatever it was walking around our tent. The footsteps stopped right near the entrance to our tent. There was this moment of complete silence that felt like it stretched forever. Then, wham! Something shoved hard against the side of the tent, making the whole structure lean inward. It wasn't a casual bump. It was deliberate, like it was testing the tent. Mike and I scrambled backward in our sleeping bags, pressing ourselves against the far side of the tent. I remember my sleeping bag got tangled around my legs and I felt trapped, like I couldn't move properly. "What the fuck is that?" Mike hissed. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. The thing moved away from the tent and we heard it start picking up items around our campsite. There was the sound of our cooler being opened, then slammed shut. Something metallic, probably our cooking pot, was thrown and hit a tree with a clang. Then we heard one of our chairs being smashed repeatedly against what must have been a tree trunk. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the clearing. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Whatever was out there was methodically destroying our campsite. It wasn't just foraging for food like a bear would. It seemed angry, deliberate. Then it went quiet again. The silence was almost worse than the noise. At least when it was making noise, we knew where it was. Now we had no idea until we heard it approaching the tent again. Slow, heavy footsteps, coming right for us. It stopped right outside the tent wall nearest my head. I could hear it breathing. Deep, heavy breaths. Not like an animal panting. More controlled, almost human, but not quite. Then I heard something that still gives me nightmares. The sound of fingernails or claws slowly dragging down the outside of the tent fabric. Not just a quick swipe, but a deliberate, slow drag from about 6 feet high down to the ground. The sound was like a zipper being pulled in slow motion. I could feel the vibration through the tent wall, inches from my face. Mike grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. Neither of us made a sound. I don't think either of us was even breathing. The dragging stopped. Then it happened again on another section of the tent. Then another, like it was testing different areas, looking for a way in, or just toying with us. I had a hunting knife in my backpack across the tent, but there was no way I was moving to get it. We were both paralyzed with fear. After what seemed like forever, the footsteps moved away from the tent. We heard more crashing and banging from around the campsite, but it seemed to be getting farther away. Eventually, the sounds faded into the forest. We sat there in complete silence for at least another hour. Neither of us wanted to risk making noise or leaving the tent. I don't think either of us even shifted position. My legs were cramping from being frozen in the same position for so long, but I didn't dare move. Around 4 in the morning, the sky started to lighten slightly. Dawn wasn't far off. Birds began their morning calls. Normal forest sounds returned. Whatever had visited us seemed to be gone. It wasn't until full daylight, around 5:30, that we finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and look outside. Holy shit, was all Mike could say. Our campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. The folding table was flipped upside down and bent in half, and this was a metal table, not some flimsy plastic thing. One of our chairs was snapped completely in half, its aluminum frame twisted like it was made of wire. The other chair was missing entirely. Our cooler had been kicked about 30 feet away, its contents strewn across the ground. But what really got me was the food bag. Remember, I'd hung it about 15 feet up in a tree, well out of reach of bears. The rope I'd used was thick nylon climbing rope, capable of supporting several hundred pounds. It had been snapped clean, like it was nothing. The food bag was gone completely. Mike spotted them first, the footprints. In the soft ground around our campsite were clear impressions. They were wide, flat footprints with 5 distinct toes visible, human-like, but much larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. We both wear size 11 boots, and these prints dwarfed ours. The stride length between prints was enormous. Mike tried to match it by taking the biggest steps he could, and he couldn't come close. Whatever made those prints was tall, really tall. Then we found one print that made my blood run cold. It was right next to our tent, precisely where my head had been while sleeping. Just inches from where I'd been lying, separated only by a thin layer of nylon tent fabric. It had been standing there, right next to my head, while we cowered inside. We didn't say much as we packed up what was left of our gear. There was no discussion about staying another night or trying to salvage the trip. We both just wanted to get the hell out of there. The hike back to the car felt 10 times longer than the hike in. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the bushes made us jump. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see something following us. We made it back to the car around 8 in the morning and drove straight off the island without stopping. We barely spoke during the 5-hour drive back to Toronto. I've gone over that night in my head thousands of times since then. I've researched known wildlife in the area. Black bears are common on Manitoulin Island, but what we experienced wasn't bear behavior. Bears don't walk exclusively on two legs for extended periods. They don't methodically destroy campsites like that. They don't drag claws down tent walls to terrorize campers. I don't know what found us that night on Manitoulin Island. Mike and I have an unspoken agreement never to talk about it. We've never been camping since. Not together, not with others, not alone. Sometimes when I can't sleep at night, I still hear that sound. Those claws dragging slowly down the tent fabric, inches from my face. And I wonder if whatever it was is still out there in those northern woods, waiting for the next campers who think they've found the perfect spot, far away from everything. Story 15. The Tim. I never thought I'd be writing something like this. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this out. I've read hundreds of these accounts over the years, always with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, despite my family history. But now, I'm the one sharing my story. My name's Andy Peterson. I live in Sweet Home, Oregon, a small logging town nestled against the foothills of the Cascades. Beautiful place, lots of forest, pretty quiet. I've lived here about 8 years now. What happened to me was in early October 2010, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I should mention that my family has some history with this kind of thing. My grandfather had a Sasquatch encounter back in '58 while hunting in British Columbia. It was actually documented in John Green's book, The Sasquatch File. Growing up, Grandpa would tell me the story on camping trips, and I always thought it was just an awesome campfire tale to spook us kids. He'd describe this massive 8-foot black-haired creature that walked right up to their campfire in the Bellicula Valley. The way he told it, they locked eyes with this thing, and it suddenly jumped away, leaving just a single heel print before disappearing into the forest. As a kid, I ate that story up. As an adult, I figured he'd seen a bear or something, and the story had grown with each retelling. I never expected to have my own experience. It was a Tuesday evening, around 6:30. The weather had been unusually warm that day, probably in the mid-70s, but it was cooling off as the sun started to set. I remember I'd spent most of the day doing yard work, clearing some brush on the edge of my property, which backs up to forest land. My place sits about a quarter mile from my nearest neighbor at the end of a gravel road. I was beat from working outside all day, so I'd showered and was just relaxing, watching some TV. I decided to grab a beer from the fridge and step out onto my back porch to enjoy the evening air. Nothing unusual about that. I do it all the time. My back porch faces west, with a great view of the sunset over the trees. There's about 30 yards of cleared yard before the tree line starts, so I'm standing there, beer in hand, just taking in the view and feeling the cool evening air. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I remember hearing a squirrel chattering in a nearby tree and the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking way off in the distance. That's when I noticed something felt different. It's hard to explain, but there was this weird feeling of being watched. I've spent enough time in the woods to know that sensation. At first I thought maybe a deer had wandered into the yard. We get them all the time. I glanced to my right, toward the north side of my property where it meets the forest, and that's when I saw it. About 50 feet away, standing partially in the shadows between two Douglas firs, was what I can only describe as a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Believe me, if someone told me this story, I'd probably roll my eyes. But I know what I saw. This thing was tall. I'd estimate around 7 feet. It had grayish hair or fur covering its body, not the dark brown or black you usually hear about. And it wasn't the massive, bulky creature you see in the Patterson film or on those beef jerky commercials. This thing was relatively thin, still muscular, but leaner than I expected. It was just standing there, watching me. I could make out its face, though not in great detail because of the shadows. But I could clearly see its outline, the way its arms hung at its sides, longer than a human's would be. Here's the craziest part. Neither of us panicked. I was frozen, sure, but not out of terror exactly. More like shock. And this creature, it didn't run away or charge at me or do anything dramatic. It just calmly turned and started walking away back into the forest. I could hear its breathing, heavy, rhythmic breathing that carried across the distance between us. Not growling or grunting, just breathing. The kind of breathing you'd hear from someone who's been exercising. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 to 7 seconds. It took a few steps, and then it was gone, disappearing into the trees without making much noise, no crashing through the underbrush, no breaking branches. It moved with this strange grace that seemed impossible for something that size. I stood there for what felt like forever, my beer still in my hand, completely untouched. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt this weird mix of fear, awe, and disbelief. When I finally got my wits about me, I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone, thinking I should call someone, but who? The police? What would I say? Officer, I just saw Bigfoot in my backyard. They'd think I was nuts or drunk. I spent that night on edge, jumping at every little sound outside. I kept the lights on and barely slept. The next morning I half expected to wake up and realize it had been some kind of weird dream or hallucination, but I knew it wasn't. After I had some coffee and gathered my courage, I went outside to the area where I'd seen the creature. The ground was soft from some rain we'd had a couple days before, and there they were. Footprints, not super clear, but definitely not from any animal I recognized. They were large, probably around 16 inches long, and showed what looked like 5 toes. They led away from where the creature had been standing and disappeared into the denser underbrush. I didn't have a camera with me. Stupid, I know. And by the time I went back to get my phone, it had started drizzling. By the time I got back, the prints were already starting to fill with water and lose their shape. In the days that followed, I started doing research. I found out there had been other reports from the hills around Sweet Home and Lynn City over the years. People describing similar creatures, similar behavior. I never thought I'd be one of those people. What really struck me about the encounter was how casual it seemed. This thing didn't act like it was afraid of me or my house or anything human. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It just seemed like I had interrupted its evening stroll, and it decided to move along. Like we were just two beings sharing the same space for a brief moment, and then it went on with its business. I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a person in a suit. But who would be wandering around the forests of Sweet Home in a Sasquatch costume? And the movement was too natural, too fluid. The breathing I heard was real. The footprints were real. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs? No way. I've seen plenty of bears. This was bipedal, walking upright with ease, not like a bear that occasionally stands up. I've gone back and forth about sharing this story. I know what the skeptics will say. I know the questions they'll ask. Why didn't you take a picture? Why didn't you follow it? Why didn't you call someone right away? All I can say is that when you're in that moment, you don't think like that. You're just experiencing something so outside your normal reality that your brain can barely process it. By the time I thought about evidence or documentation, the moment had passed. After my encounter, I called my mom and told her what happened. She wasn't surprised. She said, "You've got your grandfather's eyes now." Meaning I'd seen what he saw, that I knew the truth. I wish he was still alive so I could talk to him about it, ask him if he felt the same mix of emotions I did. It's been years since that evening, and I haven't seen anything like it again, though sometimes when I'm on my porch at dusk, I get that same feeling of being watched. I've spent more time hiking the surrounding forests, hoping for another glimpse, but no luck. I've become more attuned to the stories, though. When locals talk about strange noises in the night or unusual tracks, I don't dismiss them anymore. I've become that guy who listens intently when someone starts a story with, "You're going to think I'm crazy, but..." The thing that bothers me most isn't the fear or the disbelief from others. It's the casualness of the encounter. This creature seemed so at ease, so at home in the forest bordering my property. It makes me wonder how many times it or others like it have been near me without my knowledge. How many times have I been observed while thinking I was alone? Sometimes I'll be working in my yard and I'll get a prickle on the back of my neck and I'll look toward those same trees. There's never anything there, at least nothing I can see, but I know now what might be watching from just beyond the shadows. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe me if I hadn't experienced it myself, but I know what I saw that evening in October. I know the sound of its breathing, the sight of its silhouette, the prints it left behind. My grandfather wasn't crazy or making up stories. He saw something real in those Canadian woods over 50 years ago, and somehow, decades later, I had my own encounter just steps from my back door. These things are out there, moving quietly through the forests, mostly avoiding us, but sometimes for reasons I don't understand, allowing themselves to be seen. I don't know why it showed itself to me that day. I don't know if it was the same one that might have been watching me on other occasions. I don't know if I'll ever see another one. But I do know that the forests around us hold secrets. And sometimes, just sometimes, those secrets reveal themselves when we least expect it. Story 16. I've debated sharing this for years now. Even typing this makes my hand shake a little. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or conspiracy theories. I'm a mom. I work at the local credit union. I go to PTA meetings. Normal stuff. But what my daughter saw that night in October of 2019 has haunted our family, and I need to get it off my chest. We've lived in western Wisconsin for over 20 years. Our property sits about 15 minutes outside town. Nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom house on 5 acres with woods behind us. It's quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where you know all your neighbors even though they live half a mile away. My husband Dan works construction, I'm at the bank, and our daughter Lily was 17 at the time, finishing up high school. That night started like any other fall evening. It was early October, the leaves were turning, and there was that crisp smell in the air. Lily had gone to her friend Emma's house after school to work on a science project. She texted around 8, saying she was heading home. Our area has these winding back roads that locals know like the back of their hand. There's hardly any traffic, especially after dark, and the fields stretch out forever between patches of forest. Lily's driven these roads hundreds of times since getting her license. When she burst through our front door around 8:30, I knew something was wrong immediately. Her face was ghost white, and she was breathing hard like she'd been running. Dan was watching TV in the living room and looked up as she came in. "Mom, Dad," she said, her voice shaking. I saw something. I don't know what it was." Dan muted the TV. "What happened? Did you have an accident?" No, she said, dropping her backpack and pacing. "I was driving home and I stopped at that T intersection by the miller's old property. You know where the big open field is." I nodded. I knew exactly where she meant. About 3 miles from our house where County Road D meets Hickory Lane. There's nothing there but farmland and the tree line that borders Willow Creek. I stopped at the sign and I saw these deer, like 5 or 6 of them, just bursting out of the trees across the field. They were running so fast, like something was chasing them. She paused, and I could see her trying to find the words. And then I saw what was chasing them. "Coyotes?" Dan asked. We'd been seeing more of them lately. Lily shook her head hard. "No, not coyotes. They were huge. They were running on 2 legs." I felt a cold sensation spread through my stomach. "What do you mean, honey?" There were 2 of them. They came out of the same tree line as the deer, running after them, standing up, on 2 legs. The first one was massive, like 8 feet tall. The one behind it was a little smaller. Dan laughed nervously. "Come on, Lil." It was dark. "Your eyes were playing tricks." "Dad, no!" Her voice cracked. "I know what I saw. My headlights were pointed right at the field. The moon was bright. I watched them for like 6 or 7 seconds. They were running so fast, taking these huge strides. The big one was dark, like black or dark brown. The smaller one was more reddish brown." My mouth went dry. I'd lived in rural areas my whole life and had never heard of anything like this. "Their arms," she continued, sitting down finally. "Their arms were so long, swinging wide as they ran, and they were leaning forward, but definitely on 2 legs. They moved. God, they moved so powerfully, like nothing I've ever seen. They were catching up to the deer." "Then what happened?" I asked quietly. "The deer reached the trees on the other side and disappeared. Both of these things followed right behind them into the woods, and then everything went completely silent, like unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no nothing. It felt like the air changed." We sat in silence for a minute. Dan was the first to speak. "Lily, I'm not saying you didn't see something, but you think I'm making this up?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I know how it sounds. I didn't want to say Bigfoot because you'd think I was crazy. But that's what they look like. Exactly like all those documentaries described them." "Nobody thinks you're crazy," I said, shooting Dan a look. "We believe you saw something. They didn't have necks, Mom. Their heads sat low on their shoulders, and they were so wide, like football players, but bigger, way bigger." She was shaking now. I pulled her into a hug while Dan went to the kitchen to get her some water. That night, none of us slept well. I could hear Lily tossing and turning in her room. I lay awake thinking about what she'd described. We've all heard stories about Bigfoot, but they always seemed like campfire tales, not something that happens 3 miles from your house. The next morning over breakfast, Lily was calmer, but still adamant about what she'd seen. She'd even sketched what the creatures looked like. Her drawing showed powerful, hair-covered beings with distinctly non-human proportions. The way she'd drawn their stride, the muscular build, the arm length, it matched descriptions I'd read before, though I'd never put much stock in them. "I want to go look," Dan said suddenly. I stared at him. "You can't be serious. It's broad daylight. If Lily saw something there, maybe there are tracks, broken branches, something. I'm not saying I believe in Bigfoot, but I believe our daughter saw something that scared her. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, but I knew we couldn't just dismiss what Lily had experienced. So after Dan got back from his morning job, we drove out to the intersection. It was a perfect fall day. Blue skies, temperature in the 50s. The field where Lily had seen the creatures looked so ordinary in the daylight. We parked on the shoulder and walked into the field. "It was right there," Lily said, pointing to a spot about 30 yards into the field. "That's where they came out of the trees." We walked across, the dry grass crunching under our feet. The ground was hard-packed from the dry spell we'd been having. At the edge of the tree line, we found game trails leading into the woods. Nothing unusual about that. The grass was flattened in places, but again, that could have been from deer or other wildlife. "Let's follow the path to the creek," Dan suggested. Willow Creek runs behind this stretch of woods, creating a natural corridor for wildlife. As we picked our way through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional bird call. The creek was about 100 yards in, a shallow stream maybe 10 feet across. On the opposite bank, the tree line gave way to another field. "Perfect ambush spot," Dan muttered, surveying the area. "If something was hunting deer, this is where they'd wait." "Do you think we should report this?" I asked. Dan shook his head. "And say what? That our daughter saw Bigfoot chasing deer? They'd think we were nuts." We spent about an hour looking around, but found nothing conclusive. No clear footprints, no hair samples, nothing that would prove what Lily had seen. The hard soil didn't take impressions well, and whatever had happened the night before had left no obvious trace. On the drive home, Lily was quiet. "You still don't really believe me, do you?" she finally said. Dan sighed. "Honey, I believe you saw something. I just don't know what it was." "I know what I saw, Dad, and I'm never driving that road alone at night again." That night, I went online and started researching. I'd never given much thought to Bigfoot stories before, but now I was obsessed. I found account after account describing creatures exactly like what Lily had seen. The height, the gait, the long arms, the way they moved, it all matched. Most interestingly, I found several accounts of Bigfoot hunting deer using coordinated tactics similar to what Lily described. Over the next few weeks, we started paying more attention to things we'd previously ignored, like the strange howls we occasionally heard at night. Not quite wolf, not quite human, or the times our dogs would refuse to go outside for no apparent reason. The nights when the woods behind our house would fall completely silent. Had these things been around us all along? Were they watching us the way we watched deer from our kitchen window? Looking back, there were signs. 3 years ago, Dan found our garden gate open and strange, large impressions in the soft soil of the vegetable patch. Last summer, something killed one of our chickens and carried it off. We assumed it was a coyote, but the fence hadn't been dug under, just pushed down from above. And Lily had mentioned a horrible smell near the shed last spring, like wet dog and garbage. Classic Bigfoot sign, according to what I was reading. We've told only a few close friends about what happened. Most react with polite skepticism. One neighbor, though, an older man who's lived here his whole life, just nodded knowingly when Lily described what she'd seen. "Those woods have always had secrets," he said. "My grandfather used to call them the tall people, said they've been here longer than us." It's been almost 4 years since that night, and we haven't had another clear sighting, but we've changed our habits. We don't take walks in the woods after dark anymore. We installed better security lights around the property. Lily left for college last year, and she still refuses to drive that stretch of road when she comes home to visit. Sometimes I stand on our back porch at dusk, looking out at the tree line, and wonder if they're out there watching. I wonder if they know we saw them. I wonder what else is out there that we refuse to believe in until it's running right in front of our headlights. All I know for certain is that what my daughter saw was real. 2 massive creatures moving with impossible speed and power, hunting deer across an open field on an October night in Wisconsin. They were not bears, they were not men in suits, they were something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but does. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear them moving through the woods behind our house. Story 17. I've been trying to make sense of what happened for months now, but I still can't explain it. Writing this down might help me process it, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. This happened back in June of 2023. My son Ethan, he's 12, and I were fishing on the New River, right along the North Carolina-Virginia border. We've been going there for years. It's our special spot. Ethan was on summer break, and I had taken a few days off work to spend some quality time with him. Just us guys, fishing and camping like we always do. That particular evening, we were wading in the river near this small bridge off Farmers Fish Camp Road. The sun was starting to set, casting this golden light across the water. Perfect fishing conditions. The water was just above our knees, cool but not cold, and there was this light breeze that kept the mosquitoes away. I remember thinking how perfect everything was. I've been fishing these waters since I was a kid myself, and I've taken Ethan here since he was old enough to hold a rod. We know every bend in that river, every good spot where the bass liked to hide. This wasn't some new territory for us. This was home, away from home. I was about 20 feet from Ethan, showing him how to cast toward this fallen tree where fish tend to gather. He was getting better at it, and I felt that dad pride watching him. You know what I mean? Just enjoying seeing your kid grow into something you taught them. That's when it happened. I was mid-cast, arm pulled back, when this sound, erupted from somewhere across the river. I still struggle to describe it accurately. It wasn't anything natural, not a coyote, not a bear, not anything I've ever heard in all my years outdoors, and I've heard a lot. The best way I can put it is that it sounded like 20 people dying at once. That's the only way I can describe it. This chorus of agonizing wails layered over something impossibly deep and guttural, something that didn't sound like it could come from any animal I know. It was loud enough to fill the entire river valley, echoing off the hills around us. I froze with my arm still cocked back, rod in hand. When I looked over at Ethan, he was completely still too, one foot raised mid-step in the water. Our eyes met, and I saw pure terror in his face, probably matching my own. The sound seemed to be coming from this small hollow tucked into the woods, maybe 200 yards away, near the edge of a field across the river, and it wasn't just a quick noise. It continued for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably closer to 30 seconds. It had this deliberate quality to it, like whatever was making it was doing so intentionally, not out of pain or fear. But what really got to me was what happened to everything else around us. When that sound started, everything else went dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire forest. Even the water seemed quieter somehow. I've done 2 tours in Iraq. I've been in firefights. I've heard explosions that shook buildings and made my ears ring for days. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever affected me the way that sound did. It wasn't just fear. It was this overwhelming sense of dread, like something ancient and powerful was announcing itself, something that didn't belong in our world. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, and then there was this silence that was somehow even worse than the sound itself. Just nothing, complete stillness. I tried to act normal for Ethan's sake. "Hey, buddy," I said, but my voice came out all wrong, too high and shaky. "Let's, try over there." I pointed downstream, away from where the sound had come from. Ethan nodded, but didn't say anything. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling as he reeled in his line. I could see he was trying to be brave, but he was scared out of his mind. Hell, so was I. We kept fishing for another 15 minutes, pretending everything was normal, but neither of us was really fishing anymore. We were just going through the motions. My eyes kept darting to the tree line across the river, searching for any movement. The entire time, I felt like we were being watched. Not just watched, studied, like something intelligent was sizing us up. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's off, and every instinct in my body was screaming that we needed to get out of there. "Dad," Ethan finally whispered, breaking the silence between us. "Can we go now?" I've never been so relieved to hear those words. "Yeah, bud, let's pack it up, getting dark anyway." We didn't run, that would have been too obvious, too prey-like, but we moved with purpose. We carefully made our way back to the boat ramp, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders. I kept Ethan close, one hand on his shoulder the whole time. The walk back felt like it took forever. We had to pass through this stretch where the path narrows and trees crowd in from both sides. The whole time, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. You know that feeling when you absolutely know someone's behind you? It was like that, but worse. When we reached the truck, I practically threw our gear in the back. Ethan didn't even complain when I told him to leave his waders on until we got home. Normally, he hates sitting in wet clothes. We just wanted to get out of there. As I started the engine, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the boat ramp and into the trees beyond. For a split second, and I swear I'm not making this up, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the tree line, something big. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. The drive home was mostly silent. Ethan stared out the window, clutching his water bottle so tight his knuckles were white. About halfway home, he finally spoke. "Dad, what was that?" I wish I had an answer for him. "I don't know, buddy. Probably just some animal we've never heard before. No animal makes sounds like that, he said. And he was right. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I started searching online. I looked up every animal call I could think of. Coyotes, bears, mountain lions, even elk. Nothing came close. I found recordings of bobcats, which can sound eerily human when they scream. But what we heard was nothing like that. It was more orchestrated, like multiple sounds layered together. I even searched for Bigfoot calls and other unexplained forest sounds. Some came close, but nothing matched what we'd heard. Nothing captured that deep, almost subsonic quality that you could feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. The next morning, I called an old buddy who works as a forest ranger in the area. I tried to play it casual, just asking if there had been any strange reports lately. He laughed and asked if I'd seen a UFO. I didn't mention the sound. I don't know why, but I felt like keeping it between Ethan and me, at least for now. It's been several months, and we haven't been back to that spot since. Ethan hasn't asked to go, and I haven't suggested it. We still fish, but we've found new spots further downstream. Sometimes I catch Ethan looking over his shoulder when we're in the woods, even in broad daylight. I do it too. That sound changed something in us. It's like we both know there's something out there that we can't explain, something that doesn't fit into the world as we understand it. I keep thinking about why it affected me so deeply. I'm not easily rattled. But there was something about that sound that seemed directed at us, like it was a warning or a challenge. Or maybe it was just letting us know we were in its territory. Whatever it was, it knew we were there, and it wanted us to know it was there too. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just the sound itself, it's the intelligence behind it. Animals make noises out of instinct, to find mates, to scare off predators, to communicate with their kind. But this felt different. It felt calculated, deliberate, like it was made specifically for human ears to understand as a threat. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of weird acoustic phenomenon. Maybe it was kids playing a prank with speakers hidden in the woods, though I can't imagine how they'd produce something that powerful. Maybe it was... I don't know. I'm running out of maybes. Ethan and I don't talk about it much, but sometimes I catch him looking at me with this question in his eyes. He wants reassurance that I still don't have. All I know is that something was in those woods that evening, something that made a sound unlike anything I've ever heard before or since, something that silenced every living thing around it, something that watched us from the shadows as we retreated. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and the house is quiet, I swear I can still hear it, that awful, inhuman chorus echoing across the river valley, and I wonder if it's out there right now, making that same sound, waiting for someone else to hear it. Story 18. I've been going back and forth about whether to share this for years now. Even typing this makes my palms sweat. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, sometimes I wish I didn't believe it myself. But what happened to my wife Sarah and me back in May 2015 changed everything about how we see the world. We'd been living in our place outside Summersville, Missouri for about 6 years by then. It was everything we wanted, quiet, private, surrounded by nature. Our property sat at the edge of this beautiful clearing with forest wrapping around 3 sides. No neighbors in sight, and the nearest county road was over a mile away down our long gravel driveway. We loved that isolation, until we didn't. That spring had been particularly wet. Everything was green and growing like crazy. I remember having to mow twice a week just to keep up. We had our little hobby farm going, some chickens, a big garden, our dog Cooper, a chocolate lab mix who was the sweetest but most alert dog you could imagine. Normal country living, you know. The night it started was May 12th. I remember the date because we'd been talking about Sarah's mum coming to visit the following weekend. We went to bed around 11. Nothing unusual. The windows were cracked open because the night was cool and pleasant. I woke up to Sarah frantically shaking me. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. Before I could ask what was wrong, I heard it and felt it. This growl. That's the only word for it, but it doesn't come close to describing what this sound was. It was coming from right outside our bedroom window. Couldn't have been more than 15 feet from where we were lying. It was impossibly deep, like unnaturally deep. You could feel it vibrating through the floor and walls. It wasn't a quick growl either. It sustained for what felt like forever, rising and falling in pitch slightly. I've heard bears, cougars, even a tiger at a sanctuary once. This wasn't like any of those. This sounded like it was coming from something with a chest cavity, the size of a barrel. Sarah was clutching my arm so tight it left marks. "What is that?" she whispered. I did what any idiot husband would do, grabbed my phone for a flashlight and went to check it out. Cooper, who normally would bark at a leaf blowing across the yard, was nowhere to be seen. I found him later, curled up under the kitchen table, wide-eyed and trembling. He wouldn't make a sound, wouldn't move, just stared at the door like he was seeing something terrible. I checked the windows in the living room, then moved to the kitchen. Nothing visible, but I noticed our motion sensor light above the back porch was flickering on and off erratically. Not in the normal way when something walks by, but like something was moving just at the edge of its range, toying with it. We barely slept the rest of the night. Sarah wanted to call someone, but who? The sheriff, to report a weird growl. We convinced ourselves it must have been some strange acoustical thing, maybe a bear that wandered up from the south, though we'd never had bears in our area. When sunrise finally came, I went outside to check around. What I found still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. Our backyard looked like a tornado had hit it, except the damage was selective. The chicken coop gate had been ripped completely off its hinges. Not just unlatched, the metal hinges were bent and twisted like someone had grabbed it and yanked with incredible force. The fencing was pushed inward, not outward like something breaking out, but inward like something wanted in. 3 of our hens were just gone. A 4th was lying dead in the corner of the coop, neck broken. The sliding bolt on the coop door was open. Not broken, but open. Something had figured out how to slide it. Our raised garden boxes were completely flattened, not dug up like you'd expect if raccoons or possums were after vegetables, just crushed, like something had deliberately stomped them flat. A heavy wooden picnic table we kept near the tree line had been moved about 6 feet and turned around. This wasn't a lightweight table. It took 3 of us to position it when we built it. But the worst part, the thing that makes me question everything I thought I knew, were the footprints. They were in the soft dirt near the fence, where I'd been preparing to expand the garden. Clear impressions that were unmistakably foot-shaped, but wrong. They were huge, much longer and wider than any human foot. They had 5 toes, clearly defined, with what looked like a much wider ball of the foot than humans have. The depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the forest. The grass and brush at the edge of the trees was flattened in a path about 3 feet wide, like something large had pushed through it. When I went back inside, Sarah was trying to coax Cooper out from under the table. He still wouldn't budge. This dog who would chase deer and bark at squirrels was terrified of something outside. "What did you find?" she asked. I could tell from her face she already knew it wasn't good. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but whatever it was big, strong, and walked on 2 feet. We spent that day in a daze. Sarah called in sick to the dentist's office where she worked. I canceled a client meeting. I do IT consulting mostly from home. We kept looking out the windows, jumping at every sound. We discussed calling someone, but who? And to say what? We'd sound crazy. That night, we locked every window and door. I got my grandfather's old shotgun from the closet and loaded it, something I'd never done before, except for target shooting. Around midnight, the motion light activated again. Sarah saw it first from the living room where we were pretending to watch TV. "Tom," she whispered, nodding toward the window. The light was on, but nothing was visible in the yard. As we watched, it flickered off, then on again, like something was moving just at the edge of its range. Then the growl came again, this time from the tree line, but still close enough that we could feel it through the house. Cooper whined and pressed himself against the wall under the kitchen table. I'm not ashamed to say we slept in the guest room that night, away from the windows facing the backyard. In the morning, more damage. Our trash bins had been knocked over and dragged across the yard. One lid was missing completely. The other had what looked like puncture marks, deep indentations that went clear through the thick plastic. I called my buddy Mark, who works for the Missouri Department of Conservation. He came out that afternoon and looked at the footprints, which were still visible though, starting to erode from the moisture in the air. I honestly don't know, Tom, he said after examining them for a long time. These aren't bear. Bears have 5 toes, but the shape is all wrong. These are too narrow in the heel, too wide in the front, and the stride length. He measured the distance between prints. Whatever made these was taking steps over 4 feet apart and walking, not running. He took some photos but didn't have much else to offer. After he left, I went down a research rabbit hole online. That's when I found the reports of the Missouri Monster, or Momo, stories going back decades of a hair-covered bipedal creature in the Ozarks and eastern Missouri. The descriptions often mentioned deep growling sounds and unexplained property damage in remote areas. A few days passed quietly. We started to convince ourselves we were overreacting. Maybe it had been a bear, despite what Mark said. Maybe some local kids playing a prank, though we couldn't figure out how they could have caused that kind of damage or made those sounds. Then Sarah found the watermelon. She was checking the mail at the end of our driveway when she noticed something odd in the middle of our front yard. A watermelon, half eaten, just sitting there in the grass. We hadn't planted watermelons. The nearest place to buy one would be the grocery store 15 miles away. It looked like it had been torn open by hand, not bitten. The edges were ragged, but not showing teeth marks. That night, we barely slept at all. Nothing happened, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I ordered security cameras the next day, but they wouldn't arrive for another week. The final encounter came 2 weeks after the first incident. It was around 1 in the morning. I was still up, sitting in the dark living room with the shotgun across my lap, watching the yard through the window. Sarah had finally fallen asleep in the bedroom. The motion light came on suddenly. This time, I saw it. Standing right at the edge of the forest was something. I still struggled to describe it accurately. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. It had broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. Its entire body was covered in brownish-black hair, thick and matted in some places. But its face, that's what I can't get out of my head. It wasn't like an ape, not exactly. The face was flatter, with a wide nose and deep-set eyes that caught the porch light and reflected it back like a deer's would. Those eyes were looking directly at our house, directly at me, it felt like. I was frozen, completely unable to move or call out to Sarah. We stared at each other, this thing and me, for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then, very deliberately, it took a step backward into the trees, not turning around but stepping back, still facing the house. Then another step. Then it was gone. I sat there until sunrise, unable to move. When Sarah woke up, I told her everything. We never saw the creature again, not clearly. But for weeks afterward, our new security cameras would trigger motion alerts with nothing visible on screen. The sense of being watched persisted. We enhanced our security with more lighting and cameras, but we never felt comfortable using our backyard again. We never slept with the windows open again. We told only our closest family members about what happened, and even then, we could see they didn't really believe us. I still don't know what to believe myself, but I know what I saw. I know the sound I heard wasn't anything natural. I know something approached our home that night, something that took our livestock, terrified our dog into silence, and demonstrated strength no normal animal possesses. Yet it never tried to enter our home or directly harm us. Cooper died last year, old age, nothing suspicious. But until his last day, he would never go into that backyard alone again. Animals know things we pretend not to. I've read the skeptical explanations, the psychological theories about shared delusions. None of them explain the physical evidence we found. None of them explain that face I saw looking back at me from the tree line. Whatever visited us that May, whatever some locals call Momo or Sasquatch or whatever name you want to give it, it was real. It was intelligent. And sometimes I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, and that one day it might come back.